Good morning and welcome to the fourth annual ACC NCR Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference. My name is Veronique Stacco. I'm Assistant General Counsel at Willis Towers Watson. Additionally, I'm a board member and Vice President of the ACC NCR DI Committee. ACC NCR's commitment to diversity led to the creation of our Corporate Scholars Program 20 years ago. Since then, our DI efforts have expanded dramatically to include a DI committee with 3 subcommittees, 5 affinity groups, and more, providing more and more incredible resources to members. Last year, the board created a new vice president of DEI, and I'm thrilled to be the first to hold the position and support our volunteer leaders in promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession, particularly for in-house departments, the organizations those departments serve, and firms that provide services to those departments. If you're interested in getting involved, please reach out to Shannon Grabbing. It is remarkable that it's our 4th year hosting the ACC NCR DI conference. Each year, we have tackled difficult conversations and offered resources to our members on how to address the barriers companies face when looking to increase its DEI. Each conference has featured a compelling keynote speaker and useful sessions dedicated to sharing practical tools companies can use to drive the needle forward. If you want to go back and listen to any of those conferences, please go to our ACC NCR website. We have a specific section for DEI. Once you enter the DEI subheading, click Past Programs and Resources. Each recording from all previous conferences can be found there. The link to the website is in the chat box. We have an amazing morning scheduled for you and are grateful that you join us today for our conference titled Moving Metrics to Practice: Techniques to Increase the Impact of Your Organization's DEI Initiatives. Before we get started, let me share a few upcoming chapter DI events we hope you will mark your calendar and attend. On May 24th, the Asian American and Pacific Islander Affinity Group will be hosting a program featuring Asian American GCs at the Kennedy Center. This is sure to be an exciting event, which is open to members and in-house guests. The registration link is in the chat box. On June 6th, we'll be hosting the Diverse Law Firm Meet and Greet from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. via Zoom. Attendees will have the opportunity to meet with our firms over an hour to expand their outside counsel network. On June 8th, we will be hosting our annual Corporate Scholars Reception. The Corporate Scholars Program is the longest DEI initiative for our chapter, and we will be celebrating the 20th anniversary this year. This program was developed to increase the diversity pipeline in the in-house bar, and the chapter invests time soliciting law students from local law schools, interviewing them, and placing them in our member organizations. This year, we are inviting all of our scholars back and celebrating their accomplishments while toasting the hard work of all volunteers to keep this program running. We hope members and sponsors will join. A couple of weeks later, on June 27th, we will host a session on gender pronouns hosted by Garrison Sisson. More information to come. Lastly, please mark your calendars for July 12th. The ACC NCR Board of Directors and the Corporate Counsel Awards co-chairs and judges are excited to invite you to the 19th Annual Corporate Counsel Awards reception. Please join us to celebrate the finalists, toast the winners, and network. Invites for these upcoming events have been or will be sent in the near future. For a full list of upcoming DEI programming and events, please check the ACC NCR website. Now let's go ahead and get started with today's event. First, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's conference will be recorded and will be available at a later date. Comments today should not be publicized without permission, should not be construed as legal advice, and do not represent the positions of any company, firm, or the chapter. Please direct your attention to a few features that will help you enjoy and participate in today's program. We want this conversation to be interactive, but it can be difficult to chime in or ask a question orally on video conference. Please place all questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. The speakers will do their best to get to your questions. Today's program will be closed captioned. If you would like to see a running transcript of today's discussion, then please click Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen, and then select Enable for the live transcript. If you would like to turn off the running transcript at any time, you can click Live Transcript and then select Disable. We also suggest that you use the speaker view rather than gallery view for today's conference. We are so grateful to our sponsors joining us today: ACC NCR Ruby sponsor Perkins Coie and Emerald sponsor Kilpatrick Townsend. Both have been longtime supporters of our chapter and are here today to share compelling DI initiatives that they're using to move the DI needle within their firms. You will hear more from them later. But first, we have a special treat. We are thrilled to introduce our esteemed guest and keynote speaker, Michelle Shelton, speaking today about navigating the ever-changing landscape of DEI. Michelle Shelton is founding CEO and principal consultant of Michelle Shelton LLC, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm based in Louisville, Kentucky. As an international speaker, author, executive coach, and thought leader on DEI, Michelle guides courageous leaders beyond barriers that impede success. As a performance consultant, Michelle continues to be a preferred advisor for organizations committed to creating inclusive and equitable cultures that acknowledge, affirm, and add value to the total experience of every person under their influence. For over 20 years, Michelle's multi-sector career in pursuit of justice and equality for all included stages where she has personally seen, suffered, and survived the impact of poor leadership and toxic work cultures. To that end, she remains unapologetically committed to empowering others to join her in finding the strength and stamina to confront and conquer the ism that threaten our humanity and the bottom line at work and beyond. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
Veronique, thank you for having me. It's my absolute pleasure to be able to join all of you today. And to ACC, NCR, I wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to join you for your 4th annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference. It's been my pleasure and delight to work with Veronique and the rest of your diversity team on the planning for today's conference. And for everyone who made it past the Zoom glitch, kudos to you. We are here and ready to have just a very engaging and informative day talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for all of you who are on, I would love it if you can turn on your cameras. It's always a pleasure for me to be able to see with whom I'm in community. And, so if you have an opportunity, you've got a functional camera, please go ahead and turn that on. I'm going to share my screen as I bid you hello again, as I see all of these wonderful faces popping up, and prepare to share with you just a few thoughts that I have around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and most importantly, navigating what seems to be an ever-changing landscape around DE&I. As we think about DE&I and where we are currently, this current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we cannot have a conversation without talking about where we are societally and what has transpired, what has happened in our country. Often we like to see DE&I as something separate, as something that we add to our day-to-day and workplace and in the workforce. But actually, we know that our workplaces are microcosms of the larger society. And the reality is what happens in the world, we're no longer living in a time where folks are or can check their feelings and their responses to what's going on around them at the door and just come into work and act like everything is okay. We are in an information era where leaders don't have to be the only source for connection, for knowledge, for even community for folks when they come into work. Everyone has access to it, and we're functioning and engaging in communities across the board through a number of avenues. So what I want to talk to you all about today is we have you all coming together, those of you in the legal profession, those of you who are in human resources, and of course, all of my fellow DE&I colleagues who are practitioners out here in the space. What I want to talk to you about today is how is it that you all together can help to improve upon your leadership, within the organization and support one another in navigating this ever-changing landscape through the business partnerships that you all can develop. Today is not just about compliance, that area where we're often pulled in to talk about the legalities, if you will, those things that we need to be mindful of, that the liabilities that we could potentially have around talking about issues of race and sex in the workplace, and some of these other areas around DE&I. But today we have an opportunity to talk not just about compliance, but also community. And for you all to see yourselves being a part of that process of building community while still making sure that we honor our responsibilities and our obligations around compliance. Is that okay with you all? If so, let me see you put a thumbs up in your screens so we know that we're all on the same page. This right here is what often brings us together when we think about what it is to live in this country, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where we all think about the rights that we have as citizens, whether it's in the United States or even the rest of the world globally, as they think about what it means to be able to show up in this greater society, this community where we have certain expectations around what it is that we should be able to experience. The reality is, over the last several years, we've discovered that no, we haven't always had access to the rights and the privileges, whether it's in community in general or even in our workplaces, that we hope to. And we've had a rush of movements and folks who are stepping up and standing up, speaking out about the challenges that we face. And then, of course, we had the pandemic that hit us as we were building momentum around making sure that women had access to greater opportunities and they were having open and honest conversations about the experiences that they were having. And what COVID brought with it was the reality that we still have many challenges as it relates to disparities in this country, disparities that absolutely impact who we are, how we show up at work, and then what are those responsibilities that we have in the workplace to ensure that folks feel safe and that they're being heard when they talk about the need for flexibility. The need for flexibility, greater understanding, and acknowledgement that there are certain inequities that still exist in this community, whereas when we are suffering what we think is the same experience, the reality is that no, the pandemic obviously pulled out a number of healthcare disparities, as we saw that communities, Black and Brown communities, were dying at greater rates than our white counterparts when we not only contracted the virus, but again, also talked about your lifespan once you had it. Long COVID is still plaguing many people. And for those of you who are on here who may have lost a loved one or may still be suffering from some of the impacts, the effects of COVID, or you have loved ones who are going through it, just please know that my heart, my thoughts, and my prayers are with you as we reflect on what it is that we've been through and where it has brought us to this day. We also know that the racial justice movements created yet another opportunity for folks to really gain more insight into what was happening as we saw the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many. Folks were asking the question, how is it that we're still in this place? And we saw people from all different backgrounds coming together and saying, even if I can't relate, I want to stand with you and I want to talk about this. In those workplaces that recognized that we had all of this happening in the world, in our communities around us outside of work, and said, hey, let's take a moment to acknowledge this and talk about what we will now do within our workplace as a result of the realities that have been brought to the forefront once again. Those are the workplaces where people, even during these times of great uncertainty, of great disappointment, of great hurt, of great confusion, were able to at least feel that we were seen as human beings. But there were a lot who said, you know what, I can't stay in the place that I am, and I no longer want to work where I'm working. I no longer want to keep the same career. There are some folks who recognize that they want more out of life. They want greater contributions. They want to be able to have more fulfilling experiences at work, who were quiet quitting or just resigning altogether. And a lot of our workplaces are struggling to figure out, how do we hold on? How do we hold on to the talent that we have? And how do we continue to attract and retain great talent? How do we get back to the capacity that we need to be? And this is spurring all types of conversations in human resources with leadership and also with our legal professionals in the workplace as we ask the question of, well, how do we address these issues and not violate any rights and then our responsibilities or the privileges that people should have when they come to work? How do we handle that? And of course, we've got the EEOC now hosting a number of webinars and what have you to talk about what's still okay, what isn't, what are the things that we need to stay away from, as we still try to figure out, how do we come back together? How do we bring our country back and reunite in a way that helps us to see that we are still making progress. We have yet to fully become the United States, but we're doing our best. And now we have a greater awareness, a greater sense of understanding regarding our responsibilities to one another in terms of making space and creating opportunities for us to see that, yes, in fact, we all do, depending upon who you are, where you come from, what you look like, have different experiences as you think about what it means to be a citizen. As employers are struggling to figure out what they need to do, D&I tells us that we have to be mindful of our biases. We need to be mindful of the way we show up and engage one another, because the reality is that, recent stats have said that employees at large companies who still perceive that bias, that folks aren't ready, willing to see them for who they truly are and allow space for them to show up authentically, they actually struggle because they have employees who are nearly 3 times as likely to be disengaged at work. These are the folks who ultimately will end up quiet quitting or just resigning altogether. And we've got folks scratching their heads saying, well, what do we need to do? Because not only are we losing employees through turnover, but we're also losing millions and billions of dollars because of disengagement. Well, the reality is, folks, if we ask employees, they often tell us, in order for us to get the engagement, the innovation, the retention, and the profit that employers seek, employees are saying, if we ask them, often that they just want environments of trust. They want to feel safe, not just physically, but psychologically. They also want to work in places where there is hope. They can see, feel, and have a sense of hope that they can continue to remain there, see themselves in the future, still as a part of their organizations. So that's what brings us to this conversation around DE&I again, and thinking about how can we reimagine it. What more do we need to do as it relates to DE&I? We have conversations where we hear folks change around the acronym and they say, well, we need to prioritize diversity. And then there are those who say, no, we need to prioritize equity, because the conversation has moved from just diversity to equity, and we need to be mindful of that. But then we also have folks adding in access. We also have these conversations around belonging. And even today, as a result of all of the injustices that we've been speaking out about and fighting against, we're now having a conversation around justice. And what happens when we start thinking about this is we end up dealing with what is almost this alphabet soup around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And people are asking, well, is it DE&I? Is it DEIA or DEIB? Where do we show up with this? And how do we figure this out? And because of the overwhelm of the change in acronyms, the fact that we've got these terms that are often used interchangeably as if they're one and the same, people are overwhelmed. And now what we're talking about, and especially in conferences, I'm getting a number of requests where people are asking me to talk about diversity fatigue. Imagine that. We're tired of talking about our differences. We're tired of talking about how is it that we come together and figure out a way forward and find the strength that exists within our differences. Well, folks, what I want to do is talk with you today about a few things. And I want to talk about not getting to that place of fatigue, or if you're already there, figuring out how to rebound from it and just kind of reset and get yourself going and sustain that energy, that passion, that enthusiasm that we had when we first started talking about what we needed to do around this. And I also want to talk about 3 R's of engagement that I've identified that will help you not just personally, but collectively within your organizations, regardless of the role that you serve in, to be able to really continue to move forward and impact this. What I want to start out talking about is this idea of this momentum mindset. And this momentum mindset is in order to be able to be advanced. Well, momentum mindset, according to Fotis Philippopoulos, who talks about the anatomy of the momentum mindset. And he's got a great TED talk that you can view where he dives a little deeper in this. And he talks about this need for organizations where they're constantly looking for folks to show up much more engaged and getting to that place to where they're being innovative and helping the companies grow and continue to make an impact in their market and increase their market share and profitability and all of these great things. But he says that there are 3 critical components, 3 critical elements that have to be present for momentum mindset. And number 1 is necessity. The opportunity is number 2, and creativity is number 3. 3 elements that are necessary, that are essential, for us to be able to operate from a momentum mindset: necessity, opportunity, and creativity. Now that you have those 3 plugged in, I want you to hold on to that for a second. I'm going to come back to it. But what we're going to do right now is just kind of jump into this conversation around the evolution of equality, because I think as we think about our roles, whether it's in DE&I, whether it's in the legal department or in HR, I think it's important that we all have the same language and basic understanding of where we are in order for us to get to this place of being able to embrace this momentum mindset. Because the reality is that often we're not on the same page as we're talking about DE&I and what happens. And there's a need to be able to just kind of go back to basics on this. So often what I do is I explain it as sort of this evolution of equality. Again, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not something else that we do. It's important that we understand it's already there. It's always there. It's not an afterthought. But because of the way that we language it and the way that we've embraced it, often we think of it as, just one more thing. I remember when we first started having these conversations in my career years ago, folks were saying, well, we already have EEO compliance. Why do we need this diversity stuff? What's the difference there? Well, when we think about this evolution and we see it through that lens, equality, of course, is this notion that we started talking about when we had the civil rights movements in the 50s and the 60s, where we were demanding equal rights in the workplace for Black folks. And the reality is that because we knew that this country, the United States of America, had the history of slavery and Jim Crow laws, when it came to folks getting opportunity to be able to advance themselves and their quality of life and their family, really tap into some of the rights that were available to us in this country, we actually had to fight for those rights for the Black community, those who were descendants of slaves in this country. So this idea of equality, we had marches, we had protests. You all remember Dr. Martin Luther King and all of the folks who were actively involved and engaged in seeking equal opportunity for folks in the workplace. And you all know that we ended up with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 coming out of that. That is the legislation or the regulation that we base, the law that we base many of our compliance discussions in the workplace. We know what our responsibilities are. And that too is always evolving. We've had a number of amendments added to protect those for equal pay. We've had amendments added to protect disability, amendments that now protect and clarify the question of whether or not folks who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community have access to the same rights within the workplace. Well, before we got there in the 1960s, we had conversations also around affirmative action. And why is that? Because to just have the law on the books wasn't enough. And we realized that employers were not going to always take the approach of being proactive and making sure that folks not only had equal opportunity, but that they were doing so in significant ways. So affirmative action laws brought about quotas and expectations, especially for employers who receive federal funding. Well, then the conversation became that of once you have folks who have what equal opportunity through Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the affirmative action laws brought, once you had access, that's where we were with that, this idea of access, then how were people really being embraced and pulled in to the culture? And what we realized is it wasn't enough to just have access. What we needed to have were real conversations around how folks were then given opportunities to really be embedded in the culture, be seen, heard, and valued once they were there. So this conversation around diversity started to come up, and we started having more conversations around diversity in the 70s. They were popping up before then, but it really became a field where people were focused. We had a lot of practitioners coming out who were talking about diversity as it relates to understanding that it's not enough to just give people access, but we really need to talk about how do we create opportunities for folks to be embedded in the culture, respected, valued, and really seen. Well, with 2000, we started having conversations around inclusivity. Why? Because we recognized that we needed to have representation so that we could see people who were different in our organizations. We needed to have people who were there from different backgrounds. And once we saw them, however, then we needed to make sure that we allowed space and room for them to be able to engage. So conversations around inclusivity began popping up, and we started evaluating that and thinking about what does that mean? What does it look like for someone to actually not just be present, not just be seen as someone who checks off a box as a token, who shows up in the workplace, but how do we make sure that these folks, when they're at the table, they actually have a voice? Not only are they invited to the table, but they have a voice. And what we started hearing, Renee Myers, she had the quote that diversity is being at the dance, inclusivity is being asked to dance. And everyone likes to talk about that, right? In order for folks to really understand this idea of diversity and inclusion. But then what happened is in 2020, with all of the racial and social justice protests and everything, there was really a focus on equity and what it means to really understand what equity is. And equity is just, in my view, the truth. It's not just understanding why people may be at a disadvantage or they might not have access to the same opportunities, but equity says we need to look at the system that is in place, a system that was intentionally designed to ensure that folks who do not identify with the majority, and today we're on our way in terms of diversifying and becoming a much more brown country and world globally diverse, but the majority still was primarily white. And if you were not identifying with the white community, then often you were subject to a system that said you were othered, it marginalized, oppressed, and eliminated your access to opportunities that created massive disparities and inequities. And as we talk about equity, the conversation of fairness often comes up and folks say, well, is equity fair? Equity, I like to present to folks, is a correction to an injustice that never should have occurred. So equity often, in order to make up for substantial disparities that never should have occurred, often requires absolutely a different approach that does not focus on fairness or equality. It requires a focus on correcting injustices that never should have occurred. So that in and of itself is where we have come now when we talk about this evolution of equality. And it's important to make sure that when we're thinking about our DE&I work, that we see that as a continuation. Now, you may have noticed that on this in this process, I have rearranged diversity, inclusivity, and equity. And the acronym for that would be DIE. And that is done intentionally. Why? It's done intentionally because in order for us to be able to make the strides that we absolutely need to make, I feel that some of our traditional practices and thought patterns and belief systems around this absolutely have to die. And we have to be willing to blow things up and really start all over, or open ourselves up to the possibility of understanding that we have complicated this. We've complicated it a lot more than necessary. And if we just look at the foundation, the original intent of the work and of this process, that we can get back to a place where we can have open, honest conversations and streamline our approaches to doing this work so that we can, in fact, see ourselves as being progressive and successful in achieving some of our goals. Diversity is representation, inclusivity is making sure that you have that voice, and equity is making sure that we hear you when you tell us the truth about your experience and what is going to be necessary to improve upon your experience and get you back to the place to where we can even think about having a conversation around equality. Diversity, inclusivity, equity. You cannot have inclusivity without recognizing and acknowledging diversity, and you absolutely cannot get to a place of equity without being willing to hear, see, attempt to understand, and act on those things that come up as a result of truly including folks and their voices and their experiences in your process. Let's talk about this with regard to some symbolism that we've seen. Often when we talk about these concepts, we depend on some of the visual aids that are out there floating around. And when we think about our approach to this, it's important that we challenge even these types of explanations and get to a place to where we are pushing back and asking questions that really give us an opportunity to think about how it is that we want to engage in this space as individuals and then collectively. This is a popular visual that we see quite often, and it's a visual that shows the difference, or attempts to show the difference between equality and equity. And in showing these differences, what it often does is it shows us that we've got a situation where equity is just a matter of giving someone a little bit of extra help. And then we stop with that. And folks have been proud to show this, and they've been willing to make sure that this right here is used as the explanation for equity. But here's the challenge that we have with that. There are a number of questions that still and should come up when we look at this example. One of the things that I'm often talking with leaders about when we talk about issues of equity is equity isn't about just giving folks a hand up. Everyone's not looking for charity. People are looking for justice. They're looking for something that says we recognize that there is something in the system that has wronged you, and we are willing to make the change. But often when we see depictions of folks in this place of equity, they're often portrayed as small people, small human beings, or even children. And what happens is we don't realize this, but psychologically, it puts us in that place where we're seeing them as less than once again. So what does it do? It begins to perpetuate the status quo, in that somehow these individuals are insufficient, and we have to make up for their insufficiencies. And then again, it places the responsibility back on the individual as if there's something wrong or something that isn't right with them. So one of the things that I want to encourage you to do as you're thinking about your R's of engagement, the first one is resist the status quo. Just because people say, hey, this is the great example that we should use to be able to talk about what this looks like and how you explain the difference between equality and equity, it's important for you to be a leader and engage around this space, that you have your own understanding and clarity around what equity is and how you explain that, how you explain the differences between equality and equity, and that you do so in a way that still affirms and adds value to those who are experiencing the inequities that you're addressing. What does that require us to do? It requires us to make sure that we're resisting both the past status quos to say, well, this is the thing that we've always used, though, to explain this difference, or this is the way we've always done things. So we don't know if we have room to make changes. But also with present status quos, not just going along to get along or jumping on the bandwagon and every single trend that comes out here around DE&I. When we're talking about DE&I, it's important for organizations and leaders within other organizations to understand, how do you define diversity? How do you define it? And get very clear around what diversity looks like within your organization. Is it about race? Is it about gender representation? Is diversity around about making sure that you have different folks there from different religions or other experiences that are critical to making sure that the representation within your workforce is enhanced? It's important that we don't just always assume that every single new trend that comes out is what we need to do, because that in and of itself will make it difficult to navigate this terrain if we're always pulling from the outside instead of taking that internal look that we need to really ask the question of who we are, what does it need, and how do we show up in this space? Well, another graphic that we often see when it comes to explaining this, once we get to the place where we understand, okay, the differences between equality and equity. So we have this graphic that jumps up. And this graphic right here is similar to the previous graphic. It still shows a little person who needs a couple extra crates to lift them up, right? But then it also begins to address justice and what it means to have justice in this space. And what we see is justice, according to this graphic, says, hey, we have everyone looking through what is a chain link fence, so their view is not obstructed. The view is not obstructed. We've still got 3 individuals, and now everyone can see the game. So we have achieved justice and we've hit a home run. No pun intended. Okay. We've hit this home run. Well, I would hope that when you look at this, again, as I said before, you ask questions. You ask questions of, what does equity really look like? How do we explain it? But then also, what does justice really look like? And if we're practicing diversity and we have diverse representation in our organizations, and we have folks who have varied experiences and who come from different backgrounds, and we have a conversation around this, a true, honest, and open conversation around this, what we will find is that when it comes to justice, people have different views of justice. And there are some who will be just fine with having a chain link fence that they can look through and still see the game. But there are others who have dealt with injustice for so long that they say, why the hell is there a fence? Why am I not in the stadium? Justice says that there's no need to put me on the outskirts in the first place. I have an opportunity to be able to go into the stadium and enjoy the game like everyone else, and grab my hot dog and peanuts and ice cream and soda or slushies, whatever it is that I want, so that I can have, and you lawyers will appreciate this, the full enjoyment of the experience. Justice says we don't have anything in place that will hinder the full enjoyment of the experience. So you can choose for yourselves whether or not you feel that this is an accurate depiction of all 3 concepts or not. But again, justice says that we all have access to the same opportunity. As we're having these conversations and folks are questioning, well, why is it that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives aren't meeting the needs? Often we see statistics that say that Black employees are still struggling to really acquire the gains that they need. Black and brown employees are struggling to acquire the gains that they need in the workplace, despite the fact that in 2020, 2021, 2022, the chief diversity officer position was the position in the C-suite that was outpacing all other hires. What is the struggle? Well, the reality is we're noticing that even though we are attempting to address the fact that there are inequities that exist, we are still perpetuating them, even in the hiring of the roles of the folks who are supposed to help us fix this. When we think about the representation in these roles, when we have white people representing 76.1%, when we look at these statistics by race and by gender, Black or African Americans, those who have often been the subject of the greatest injustices in this country, they are only 3.8% of those who are representing those who are in these chief diversity officer roles. And then we have disparities around pay. Still, we have men earning at higher rates than women in this space. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what else do we need to do if we're still, even in this space, perpetuating the status quo? Well, we've got to think about how do we resource the pursuit? How do we resource the pursuit, if you will, of true diversity, equity, inclusivity, and equity? How do we resource that pursuit? And we've got to think of this through the lens of human and financial capital. You can't have conversations about how to address and improve upon inequities if you don't have the people who have been most impacted by them in roles and in spaces and places leading the conversations, at the very least contributing to the conversations. So again, it's critical to make sure that we're not just talking about valuing, seeing, and respecting all persons, but that we really make sure that folks are at the table and that they're showing up and their voices are being heard as they are allowed to share their experiences for what they are. And many of the chief diversity officers that we have in place, their tenure is less than 2 years because they get into organizations and they find that they don't have the resources, again, human or financial, to be able to help them actually do the work, or they're misplaced because they're put into the HR department, a department that they're often expected to audit. And they have to figure out, how do I do this without upsetting my leader or alienating myself, because I have to talk about the challenges that we still face and the areas that we absolutely must improve upon in order to practice integrity around this space. Again, we have to think about who needs to be there and what is it going to take? What resources do we have within our organizations to make sure that we have what's necessary to be able to ask the hard questions, face them in truth, and then, of course, have the resources available to make corrections, whether it be hiring of more individuals, creating a team of folks who can focus on this, capital for us to be able to activate initiatives and also make corrections to inequities that are uncovered. It's critical to make sure that we resource the pursuit. And in addition to this, as you think about your own leadership and how you show up as an individual, sometimes the resource is you and your knowledge and your willingness to engage, or the recognition that you don't have the knowledge that is necessary to lead in this space. Are you willing to admit to what you don't know and see that as a strength, not a weakness? Because it shows that you are committed to making sure that you gather the information that's necessary to be able to be effective in this space. And you want to make sure that you're showing up with as much strength and knowledge as you possibly can to support your peers as you are working on this together. So what professional development do you need to engage in so that you can upskill in this space? What experiences do you need to make sure that you are intentional about pursuing, whether it's in community so that you can learn more about folks who are different from you and the experiences that they have? And at the very least, learn to challenge your own beliefs and trust the experiences of others. One of the most damaging things that can happen as we start having these conversations around experiences and what it will take to create more inclusivity and address inequities is for folks to share their personal experiences and to not be believed. Often, if we can't relate directly, we're quick to dismiss, or if it doesn't fit the stereotypes or the biases that we have and we can't achieve confirmation bias, then we're quick to be extremely dismissive. And it's critical that we push back and challenge ourselves to be open to the experiences of others. So with that, what I like to do in order to help folks understand the differences between equality, equity, and justice is talk about it systemically. Because when we talk about it from an individual perspective, then folks often get to this place where they're concerned about whether or not they're being seen as racist or otherwise. And often that challenges us. But when we look at this through the lens of the system that we all live in, inequality says that we've got a system represented by the tree that leans to one side. Equality says we can give both sides equal tools or equal support. But if the system is leaning in favor of the other side, even having the same size ladder as these two individuals have does not give me access to the full enjoyment of what is provided by the system. So equity says what you do is you recognize there's a need to give a taller ladder to the individual who so that they can reach the access to what's the system is providing. But justice says, you know what, we don't just focus on the individuals and trying to fix or make adjustments where they're concerned. We actually have the audacity to confront the system and call out the system for the fact that it's the system that needs to be adjusted, changed. And that system in our workplaces is often our policies, our practices, those things that we hold near and dear, those things that we say, well, this is what this organization was built upon. Sometimes when we have those honest conversations, what we realize is our systems that were built at a very different time do not accommodate where we are today, the extent to which we have evolved, the extent to which we have grown. And it may mean that we need to go back and reevaluate everything all the way back to our mission, vision, and values. And then certainly some of our policies and practices around how we engage people and create opportunities for them in the workplace. So that last R of engagement for you all is respond to the truth. The truth that once we start evaluating our system through this lens of justice, that it is in fact something that we may need to make some serious commitments and serious investment in correcting for the sake of helping everyone to move forward. Respond to the truth of what is coming out as you are engaging one another. Respond to the truth that comes out as you are honestly evaluating your system to see if you are as an organization practicing integrity around the goals that you set and the claims that you make in terms of what you will provide. So as I prepare to close, I just want to go through a quick review and remind everyone that the truth is that diversity, inclusivity, and equity is a process. It's a process that is ongoing. It's ongoing, and it's something that is absolutely there as the foundation. It's the fundamental of what it is that we need to do to approach this. But when it comes to momentum and maintaining that momentum mindset, do you notice that there are actually links between what it is that we do around diversity, inclusivity, and equity as when it comes to what we need to maintain that momentum mindset? Represented in the workplace speak to the necessity, why this is absolutely necessary, why it's necessary for us to figure this out, folks, and make sure that people are having better experiences. And as we engage inclusively with one another and we create spaces for more people to be at the table and share their voices, we find that there is opportunity for us to make a decision around how we will choose to show up in this space. Because ultimately, inclusivity, folks, is not just about sitting and listening. Inclusivity is about also making a decision around how you're going to move forward once you hear the experiences or the perspectives of those that you've invited to the table. And then once you have an opportunity to recognize that, then it moves you into that space of creativity as the healthy exchange of ideas and information. And then most importantly, what courage will you show in making a choice to do things differently, especially with all of these new resources that you have that can bring innovation and thought process and improvement to everything that you're doing. As you think about how you're going to show up around this, again, those 3 R's of engagement: resist the status quo, resource the pursuit, and respond to the truth. And what I have for you next is I want to just give you all an opportunity really quickly. I want to ask you to just take 2 minutes, if you will, to be able to give me a little bit of feedback. I've got a gift for you for being here and listening in for me today. And through this, if you've got an opportunity, go ahead and scan this QR code. Take just it shouldn't take any more than 2 minutes to be able to give me some feedback. And then I'm going to come back to you with my final thought and we will wrap up. As you scan the QR code, what you're going to get, or if you go to this website, talk.ac/Michelle Shelton, you'll be asked for a code. The code is YOURS. It's yours, YOURS. And you will have a gift at the completion of this that will come to your email. Okay, remember I talked about, thank you to all of you who've had an opportunity to go there. Remember I talked about those 3 R's of engagement. I talked to you about maintaining that momentum mindset for you to be able to stay actively engaged, to not fall subject to diversity fatigue and all of these things that are coming out, and having clarity around what it is that you do. It requires courage, folks. It requires courage and you making the choice to stay engaged in this journey. You hear often that this isn't something that you can complete overnight. It is a journey. It takes time. And the journey is something that I talk about, and have put together in this figure here, this cycle that I see happening quite frequently when it comes to DE&I. We have courage when there's a massive event or something comes up and we decide we're going to address this. We saw that with all of the movements here of late over the past several years. In our workplaces, when we recognize there's a need for us to address DE&I, we come at it with a strong sense of courage and conviction even. We're ready to address this. We're going to tackle it. But what happens after we've had a few initiatives, we've launched a few programs, had a couple trainings, folks kind of get to this place to where they start to relax into this and they get comfortable. And they hang out in this place of comfort and complacency until another challenge arises. And that challenge that arises often throws us what feels like a couple feet back to where we started, or makes us question whether or not this is worth our time and our attention, makes us question whether or not we really can make headway around this. What I want to encourage you all to do is just make sure that as you're navigating this, you do so again with clarity. Hold on to that courage. Make sure that you maintain your momentum. And if you do all of that, folks, I promise you that will help you to successfully navigate all of the things that happen within this DE&I landscape. DE&I, DI&E, diversity, inclusivity, and equity, they are sufficient all on their own. Because if we do them according to the way they were created and what they were originally intended to do, then we will address all of those other issues. When it comes to belonging, it's not our place to create belonging in the workplace. If we do what is required of us through making sure that there's diverse representation, making sure that folks are included, making sure that we're addressing inequities, then the employees themselves will get to the place to where they will feel a sense of belonging. It's up to them to decide when they get there. Our responsibility is to create that culture, that community, if you will, within the workplace that is conducive to helping them achieve that. With that, I want to say thank you to all of you. It's been my absolute pleasure to be able to engage you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I will see you back actually at your breakout sessions when you're having some conversation around that. But again, I want to take time to just say thank you for being here. Thank you for your ongoing commitment to this work. And again, take good care, everyone. Bye-bye.
On behalf of our chapter, I would like to extend a special thank you to Michelle Shelton. Today's objective is to offer the audience practical ways to move the DI needle within their organizations. Your insights have certainly provided keys for many to start the disruption necessary to impact their company's DI. Thank you for being here and speaking with us today. Now, we're trying to be mindful of your time. We realize that we started later because of the technical difficulty. So unfortunately, we're going to have to forego the break, but you will have a break after the second session. Thank you, everyone, for your understanding.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Tamika Warner, and I am Senior Director and Deputy General Counsel at Fannie Mae. I'm also co-chair of the ACC NCR DEI Programming Subcommittee that's bringing you this conference today. Before we transition to our first sponsored session of the day, we do have a special update. Many of you will recall that at last year's conference, we featured information from about the DEI maturity model, and that was developed by ACC Global and the ACC Foundation. This is a tool to measure the maturity of DEI at your company, and we're thrilled to have an update for you from ACC Foundation's Program Director, KJ Forrest. He will be sharing some interesting information from some data of companies that have already shared insights about their DEI efforts by completing an assessment that ACC Foundation and ACC Global have put out in connection with the maturity model. And so here is KJ Forrest.
Hi, I'm Keelan Forrest, Program Director for the ACC Foundation. I'm here to talk to you today about the ACC Foundation DEI Maturity Assessment Tool. So, the data has shown for a while now that DEI is a game changer for organizations. Companies that display value in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging through their processes, procedures, culture, and resource allocation perform better than those that lag in this area. Some data points around this are highly inclusive companies are more likely to hit financial targets by up to 120%. And companies that are in the top 1/4 for ethnic and cultural diversity outperform their counterparts in the bottom quartile by 36% in return on equity. So the data is clear. Nonetheless, legal departments and their organizations still struggle with advancing DEI. And sure, they're bad faith actors and those that stand as active barriers to DEI advancement, but many companies struggle here simply due to not knowing where to start. And the ACC Foundation and our partner in this initiative, Ethisphere, wanted to provide legal departments and their organizations with the tools to identify what a mature DEI program looks like, assess where they are in their own journeys, and then chart a path to increase DEI success. Thus, the development of the ACC Foundation DEI Maturity Model and the partnership with Ethisphere that birthed the ACC Foundation DEI Maturity Assessment Tool. The ACC Foundation and our partner in this initiative, Ethisphere, wanted to provide legal departments and their organizations with the tools to identify what a mature DEI program looks like, assess where they are in their own journeys, and then chart a path to increase DEI success. That's the development of the ACC Foundation DEI Maturity Model and the partnership with Ethisphere that birthed the ACC Foundation DEI Maturity Assessment Tool. So the DEI maturity assessment tool is based on the foundation's maturity model. And the maturity model is a self-assessment tool that shows the early, intermediate, and advanced maturity level for DEI processes initiatives across 13 business categories and was developed in collaboration with several well-known organizations that were kind enough to share candidly their DEI journeys, challenges, and solutions to inform the model. And here are a few of the organizations that lent their experience with DEI to us to help us build the model and the tool. So in November of 2022, we took the maturity model to the next level with the release of the DEI Maturity Assessment Tool powered by Ethisphere. This tool allows organizations to enter their DEI progress into our platform through an online assessment tool. And it produces a quantifiable report that shows where you are in your DEI journey and benchmarks your success against that of other organizations that have completed the assessment. This tool is a game changer for organizations that are committed to advancing DEI and are looking for a starting point for their efforts or a path for where to go next. So while the data is anonymized, we don't share any information about individual companies. Aggregated preliminary results have already started coming in. Early findings reveal organizations continue to struggle to achieve DEI success. On a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the least mature and 5 being the most, the benchmark average currently stands at a 2. The data also reveals that organizations score better on questions about planning and strategy, but more poorly on process and action questions, implying that organizations have good intentions here, but are still struggling with implementation. And so these are just some of the insights the data reveals once you receive your results. So we have a couple of asks here. First, if you haven't taken the DEI maturity assessment, please do. There's a QR code here that takes you directly to the assessment so you can get started immediately. Second, please spread the word. This already effective tool becomes even more powerful the more data it's empowered with. So tell your colleagues and professional connections about the tool. And third, we would love to hear your feedback. Let us know about your experience with the model and the assessment and how they've enhanced your DEI journey. And also, if you have any questions or want to share feedback, please contact foundation@acc.com, or you can contact me directly at k.forrest@acc.com. Thank you.
Thank you to KJ for that video clip. I'm Matt Seiler, General Counsel at the National Community Pharmacists Association. I encourage all of our in-house council attendees to consider using the ACC and ACC Foundation's DEI Maturity Assessment tool in your company. Now let's get started with our first session of the day. We are pleased to welcome Perkins Coie to discuss legal interconnection of retention and promotion of diverse lawyers. As a reminder, if you have questions during this session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The panel will address your questions as time permits. As a reminder, all remarks made by these panelists are their own opinions and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily reflect the viewpoints of their company or firm or of ACC NCR. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's presentation. Practicing at the intersection of financial regulation and technological innovation, Valerie DeHia advises financial services clients on complex compliance, regulatory, and transactional matters arising under SEC and FINRA jurisdiction. She is the managing partner of Perkins Coie's Washington, D.C. office and the firm-wide chair of the Securities Trading and Markets practice. Richard Ross is at Perkins Coie's manager in mergers and acquisitions practice with a focus on the technology industry. He represents companies, private equity funds, hedge funds, and investment banks in a variety of complex corporate transactions. Dennis Hopkins is also a partner in Perkins Coie's intellectual property and patent litigation practices. He focuses his practice on all aspects of intellectual property law, with the emphasis on patent, copyright, and trade secret litigation. Dennis has significant experience in all phases of IP litigation. Lingling Nai is the Deputy General Counsel, Chief Compliance and ESG Officer, and Head of Government Affairs at Aura, an intelligence safety company that makes the internet safer for consumers. She previously served as General Counsel and Vice President for Ethics and Compliance at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And prior to that, she was the Chief Compliance Officer and Assistant General Counsel at the Panasonic Corporation of North America. In 2021, she received the General Counsel Award from the Atlanta Business Chronicle and the Georgia chapter of the Association of Corporate Counsel. With that, let's begin today's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for the kind introduction. Also, thank you to ACC NCR for hosting this amazing event. Thank you to the wonderful panelists that you'll hear from today. And thank you to the audience for participating and sharing your time with us this morning. A significant amount of time has been spent on discussions regarding DE&I efforts and the impact of COVID. One of the key topics that has really come to the fore has been around remote versus in-office and what leads to a more inclusive, equitable, and diverse culture and workforce. While this panel will provide thoughts, considerations, and insights, it is important to recognize that to achieve DE&I goals, first, you must have goals. Second, those goals have to be tailored to your specific workforce and culture. Third, it is an iterative, dynamic, and evolving process. And lastly, you need mechanisms to assess success and likely accountability measures. So to our panelists, many companies now use flexible work schedules and geographic flexibility to enhance recruitment and retention efforts. What are some of the impacts that you've seen to underrepresented diverse lawyers, both positive and potentially negative? So I'll start with Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Val. On the positive side, it allows you any sort of flexibility geographically, allows you to go after a broader pool of attorneys to hire. So in that sense, it's very positive for diverse lawyers, and diverse lawyers could be gender, but also ethnicity, but also living situation too, right? And I live in Brooklyn, New York. That may not work for a whole lot of people, right? But you can still work in New York and have the flexibility that gets created by remote working. The downside is that being remote makes it very difficult to maintain that personal touch, which is extremely important for training, for mentoring, for sponsorship. it and is historically that's been difficult for diverse lawyers, even when they're in the office, to get the mentoring and the sponsorship. And so it just creates an additional barrier to it. Lastly, you can never, we're right here on the Zoom platform, having a meeting and talking about very important issues, but this does not make up for what's gained from personal interaction.
Ling, did you have thoughts as well?
Well, first of all, good morning to everybody from Atlanta, where I work from my home. I am a remote attorney, so I'm sort of a real life example of what we're talking about today. But my company, Aura, is based in Boston, and there is no office in the Southeast, really. So all of the benefits and the challenges that Richard spoke about are sort of real life for me. I think in terms of advantages, it is a very advantageous situation to be in, to work for an amazing company, but not having to relocate from my home here in Atlanta. My parents are older, they live in the area as well. So it's important for me to be close by. So if our company was only hiring folks who were in Boston, I would not be able to, consider that role at this time in my life. So certainly I'm a benefit. That benefit is something that I'm experiencing. But certainly there are disadvantages as well in terms of the in-person interaction and some of the inefficiencies that come with that, as well as the wellness issues, which is not this panel, but there's amazing flexibility that comes with working from home, but there's also some downsides too with social isolation. So this is a very important topic, and I'm glad we're spending time on it this morning.
Great, thanks. So Dennis, as we thinking about the pros and the cons that Ling and Richard focused on, one of the cons that I hear talked about with a certain level of frequency is the issue around integration, especially for people who changed jobs, which there were many during, in the heart of the pandemic, where everyone was pretty remote. And those feelings around what does integration look like in a fully remote or a hybrid work setting? What are some of the considerations there for, do you need to be intentional? What does intentionality look like?
Yeah, I think, first of all, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. You have to be intentional. You always had to be intentional. I think even before the pandemic and before the popularity, I guess, of remote working, there was always a problem with diverse attorneys being well integrated into the organization, whether it be a law firm or a corporation. Making sure that anyone who's seen it has kind of probably observed that sometimes people who are diverse don't necessarily appear to be who they are, or mistaken for someone who's not necessarily in their position. Maybe you're not an attorney, maybe you're paralegal or whatever. So that integration and bringing forth the information about who they are is extremely important. The visibility is extremely important, whether it's remote or not. And it's always been the case. I think adding a remote environment adds additional challenges in getting that done and making sure that diverse attorneys get the visibility that they deserve, the credit for the work that they do. That's one thing that I think is extremely important. When work pops up on your computer, you may not necessarily know who did it, who contributed to it, because in an office environment, you can actually see people working on things, stop by and talk to them and whatnot, but you don't necessarily get to see the collaboration and the actual contributions that diverse attorneys make. That being said, you have to make a deliberate effort to try to identify those contributions. And I think it's a two-way thing. Diverse attorneys must make sure that they find ways to get credit for what they do, get the visibility that they need, get seen for who they are, make sure that people understand that they are part of the team and whatnot. But leaders must also make a deliberate effort to identify folks and understand what they did. And probably one of the more important things is get to know who they are. it's pretty easy when, you're on a call like this with a whole ton of people. It's very difficult to actually get to know someone. So if you had someone who joined your organization recently, they may not even pop up on your screen. I mean, you may have to scroll through just to actually see them. So I think leaders have to make a deliberate effort to identify people in their organization and understand who they are, have a call with them, have periodic calls with them, just to understand who they are, not necessarily to discuss specific business, but to understand who they are, let them know that they fit into the organization, make them understand that they fit into the organization, and let them know that you're available. So I think that there are significant challenges to making sure that diverse attorneys are integrated in a remote environment, but they are, I think, if you make a deliberate effort, they're pretty easy to tackle those challenges. So
I want to put something out there. I mentor a number of different associates or junior attorneys, both in-house and in private practice, also in public service. And this question about integration and visibility comes up it comes up, I feel like, in almost every conversation. And because these are primarily diverse attorneys, women, people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, I kind of grapple with the advice to give, because honestly, it depends on the entity. There are entities that are primarily in office, but they give people the flexibility to work from home. There are companies that are primarily remote. And then there are entities that are hybrid, where maybe there's an expectation, or maybe it's just up to you whether you come into the office or not. And I find that I really have to unpack what their specific circumstances or situations are before I provide any type of, my opinion or any type of advice to guide them. And so I'm curious to hear from the panelists, when you're in those situations. I had a specific instance where it seems like the senior management team of the entity, they're routinely in the office, and this person was hired right before everything shut down, and they felt like they just didn't have visibility, that they were kind of getting lost in the system. My advice was, I know that you appreciate the ability to work from home, but I don't know that it's the best thing for your career. I think being a person of color and being a woman, you should probably show up and be visible consistently, because there are opportunities that are generated by being present. And it may give you an edge over others who may not take that opportunity. So curious to hear what your thoughts are when it comes to how you advise attorneys that are in-house on, how do you remain relevant? How do you remain visible?
Well, I think technology allows us to be visible in different ways now. And I think showing up in person, obviously, is something that's really hard to replicate on a different sort of screen. But it is sort of the reality of today, that we have the technology now to have a remote workforce, and it's redefining, I think, what showing up really means. And there are people who do come into the office every day and close their door in their office. And so they're there in the office, but they're not interacting. They're not having those meaningful encounters, meaningful conversations. And as you say, delivering sort of that humanity, that human piece of conversation that can really, really make a difference when it comes to decisions about, promotions and projects. So I think this maybe highlights the need for a new type of training on diversity, equity, and inclusion that addresses this exact question that you're raising. A lot of the diversity training now is very high level, but I think they haven't quite adapted to the remote work environment and made actual suggestions for managers to take up in in counseling their workforce. So they are providing opportunities for those who are remote and those who are in the office or those who are hybrid that can significantly reduce some of these inequities that result from these different work situations. So, I would encourage managers to, continuing to value these types of conversations and not dismissing them. And then encouraging their company to modify some of the training that's being delivered to their workforce to address this very specifically, because it's not fair to make the manager solely responsible for ensuring DE&I is a large consideration in sort of the remote work environment. It is very much a company responsibility to address that. So, I know we talked about this as we were prepping for this call, but I do want to highlight, an article that I thought was particularly informative. It was in the Atlantic and it came out last summer, written by Derek Thompson, and it's called The Biggest Problem with Remote Work. And I think what I took away from that is that remote work is really a permanent shift in the American or global workforce that is made possible now through technology. It's not sort of a blip in our timeline that we just need to, manage through for a short time and then go back to the way we were. I think it is here to stay. And one of the parallels that this author sort of drew was, in the 1840s, even as late as the 1840s, there was no such thing as a middle manager. Companies had a CEO who was the owner, and they had a workforce, and he or she would be the one directing that workforce. But as our capabilities in terms of technology increased, our ability to travel long distances in a short amount of time, the ability to ship goods across the country in a short amount of time, increased the capacity of companies to fulfill a larger sort of consumer base. And so no longer was it possible for one person to make all the decisions. They had to expand upon that and create what they call the middle managers, who could make those decisions more quickly to support, the current market and the new demands. And so what the article talked about is that for us to continue to support remote work, we have to realize this is a huge historical cultural shift in working. And maybe what needs to happen is the creation of new roles to better manage that. So it's not the manager who's having to add on to their long list of responsibilities, having to work through the inequities that remote work can sometimes, produce. And the suggestion was to create a role called the synchronizer, and the synchronizer would look at all of the roles at a company and designate which ones are appropriate for remote work and which ones are not, because there absolutely are positions that you cannot do remotely, logistically, for one, but two, you can't do it well remotely. And so if you kind of at the outset designate that and make it clear to the workforce which roles can be done remote and which can't, it removes a lot of the frustration that I think we're seeing in today's environment from people who are not understanding why they can't work remotely when they have been due to necessity during the pandemic. And the synchronizer would not also, designate sort of which roles can be done remote and not. They would also designate which roles can be done asynchronously, not during work hours, which can be very helpful for some people who aren't able to work during regular work hours, and be that person, as Dennis mentioned, to ensure there's coordination between your remote workforce and your in-person workforce to remove the barriers. So you're really helping managers be productive and effective in trying to drive progress, with their efforts, but they can't do it alone.
Thanks, Ling Ling. Those are great points. When you're talking about, you mentioned shared responsibilities, and that means when I think of shared responsibilities, that makes me think of there are the leaders' responsibilities, but then there are the people who are the rank and file employees who are looking for opportunities to grow, to be promoted, to be more fully integrated. When we're thinking about shared responsibilities in that context, if you are fully remote, could each one of you give some examples of what you think intentionality looks like under those circumstances, or what you would say are some best practices that you've seen?
You're gonna call on me or anybody specifically?
No, Richard, I want to hear from all of you guys, because I know that you all have seen and experienced things and have great things to share, but we'll start with Richard.
Right. So fully remote, I mean, there was a period during this pandemic when we were just completely remote and we could not go into our offices. It did not mean that you could not find time to actually meet a client in person who was also, you had to keep your distance and all the rest, but it gave you an opportunity to meet a client in person. An outside cafe, for example, would allow you to do that. Other aspects of being remote, you sort of think about it, our clients are oftentimes in other cities or other countries. And so you don't see them every day. And to be honest with you, before the pandemic, you didn't even know what they look like. There are people who are senior at my firm who I would have spoken with over the years, and I didn't know what they looked like until Zoom showed up, which is kind of crazy. But there's always conference calls. Well, intentionality being remote means you go to that client, and you take that trip. And so it's pretty similar to that. Why do you take the trip? You grab dinner with your client, you grab drinks with your client, to have a meeting, bring them to your offices so that you can build the human contact. And so if you're fully remote, that does not mean that you can't find time on a calendar to actually meet someplace in person, to sort of build the relationship. And maintain a relationship. And I've seen that in cases of GCs who have companies which are based in New England. They live down south, very similar to what's going on with Langley. I've seen situations where the workforce is fully remote or a job is fully remote, but they will go and do their tour of duty in the actual city where the company is. So at the end of the day, the real idea here is to increase that human contact, because that's just going to be necessary to do it. It's not like everything was necessarily great as before. I mean, we've always had these barriers, and you can be in the office next to people and they don't even talk to you. All right, and this is pre-pandemic, so it's really about But even at that time period, diverse attorneys would need to go and walk the halls, knock on people's doors and say, introduce themselves. Well, now they may, do the same, set up a coffee. I'll be in the office on Wednesday, or I'll be in the New York office on Tuesday. Are you going to be there? Let's get together for coffee. Let's speak. Again, that's the intentionality on the part of the diverse attorney to make sure that connections are there.
Yeah, I think picking up on what Richard has said, protocols have changed and they continue to change, but they've changed a lot recently as far as how you can interact with someone. I recall, and some of you may recall, some of you may not, when I first started practicing, we all wore a suit and tie in the office. We came into the office every day, we wore a suit and tie. If you wanted to leave your office, you had to put on your jacket. So you could sit in your office with no jacket on, just your shirt and tie. But even if you went to the bathroom, you had to put your jacket on and have a full suit whenever you're seen outside in the halls. And as an associate, if I wanted to speak to Val, I would have to walk down the hall, put on my jacket first, then walk down the hall, walk past Val's assistant. Or actually walk past Val's office to her assistant, ask her and quietly whisper to her assistant, "Hey, I need to talk to Val about such and such," or whatever. And then her assistant would find a time, and we didn't have calendars we didn't rely on calendars as much as we do now, would find a time for me to talk to, but I couldn't just walk into Val's office. And I had on my, suit and tie again. So I go back to my office, sit down, take my jacket off, and wait, until I had a time to interact with Val. That changed when things got a little bit more casual, and I could actually walk down and maybe talk to somebody and whatever, just walk in their office. But now we have the challenge then, if I want to talk to Val, I have to check her schedule, or I have to email her, and there's several emails going back and forth as to when we can set up a call. And then finally, it results in a calendar invite, which may be a day or two from now, just, to get a brief call in. So there are a lot of challenges there that we have to understand. And as long as we understand them, then they become, the insurmountable becomes surmountable. And so now what recently I've just started doing, just to get better interaction, I just, believe it or not, I just call people. I don't set up a calendar invite. I don't do all that. I just pick up the phone and call. If they pick up the phone, they pick up the phone. If they don't, I leave a message and call them back later. But I'm trying to, I think in order to meet some of these challenges, we have to kind of go back to just trying to interact with people without, some of these protocols that I think are barriers to us being able to interact more. And so if I want to talk to Val now, at the end of this, I know she's busy, but I'll just call her, or I'll, message her. Even that is a little bit difficult, but even with dealing with clients sometimes, and they actually appreciate the fact that you called them to tell them XYZ, which could have taken 2 minutes to tell them something, rather than set up a whole bunch of calls. I need to, talk to you about X. And there's a lot of back and forth and whatnot, and it becomes 2 or 3 days before you can actually talk to someone. So I think that, and I don't know if this falls into the best practices areas, I think we need to drop some of the protocols, in order to, not all the time, but drop some of the protocols sometimes when it's appropriate, in order to increase our interactions with people, and just reach out, just call somebody and talk to them.
Yeah, and I think that intentionality and that action should be at all levels. There's some commentary in the chat about why is it always the more junior person having to reach out and schedule the in-person interactions or schedule time with their mentor or their supervisor. And it's a very, very good point, and it works both ways. And obviously one tool that an organization can use to ensure it is both ways is the performance review, and including metrics in there that measure the degree of interaction that has been driven by that particular employee to ensure there is connectivity with their remote workforce. And even higher than that, this is an organizational responsibility. You cannot leave it to your employees to, on their own, figure it out. One, that's not fair. Two, it leads to inequitable results across the company, because you're always going to have managers who are going to be champions of driving connectivity more than others. So it is an organizational challenge, and it needs to be viewed that way.
And I think it goes back to the shared responsibility, and then how do you weight that shared responsibility? While historically, and I'm speaking as a Black woman who's been in professional and in financial services the entirety of my career, and the majority of people in my profession do not look like me, and so I know firsthand that I have to, that the responsibility at the end of the day is on me. I can look to leadership, I can look to management, but if the entity that I am working with or that I'm working for, if it is not a goal, a part of their culture, a part of their strategic plan, then it's incumbent on me as a professional to figure it out. So I absolutely agree that the focus should not be on, on the employee to this is on you. But unfortunately, that more often than not, it really is. And that is why we have so many issues with regard to, diverse attorneys being able to really find purchase, whether it's in-house or in private practice. So I appreciate the comments, and there are things that I grapple with all the time. And my comments are very much tailored to the audience. So if someone in a leadership position is asking for advice or my thoughts, it's very different. And it's more process oriented, that it has to be embedded in your culture. And what does that mean? What are the indicia of that? How do you monitor it? How do you incentivize it? Is there a mechanism to hold people accountable? And so I think that those are the kinds of things that you really start to grapple with. But on the other end of the spectrum, when you're talking to attorneys and they're like, oh, well, I don't feel like I'm integrated. And then my question is, what have you done? Like, what affirmative steps have you taken to ensure, because you can't just rely on others to do it for you. You have to have a clear plan and understand what is your goal here: to be visible, to be excellent, to get appropriate training, and how do you do that? And so I guess the next question to the panelists would be around the conversations, the generational divide. That it's one thing if you're talking to someone who's been in the industry for 20 years and, like they are well versed, they understand the practice of law, the business side. It's a different conversation often when you're talking to more junior attorneys. And just want to hear your feedback on, do you believe that there is a generational difference? And if so, what are some of the considerations that people should be taking into account? And how do you implement a better system to address what may be generational differences? Ling, I'll start with you. Or Richard.
Well, I absolutely think there are generational differences. And you could have an entire conference based on that topic alone, because there's lots of opinions on that. But I think it just goes back to what we talked about, how everyone has a role in this. And those who have been around for a longer time, who may be more accustomed to not having to accommodate sort of the interest and the platforms that the younger generation may utilize for communication, will need to get over that and start to change and adopt the technology that is now here to stay. And on the same side of things, the younger generation has to also be understanding that it takes time for people to adapt to new ways of communicating. It takes time for people to adapt to new ways of understanding relationships and diversity, and how best to cultivate and facilitate equity. And so I think continued understanding and empathy is important. And that kind of highlights, again, my earlier point about training. We have to kind of train folks to understand the generational differences. I'm not sure how much current sort of out of the box diversity training really touches on that topic. So it's an opportunity, I think, for those who offer that type of training to really innovate and address the issues that you've explained.
Dennis, Richard?
Yeah, I think there are definitely generational differences, but that's every generation is different than a previous generation. I mean, what Dennis described a few minutes ago about walking, how he now unless Dennis is in the same generation for each of those same moments when he's sitting on camera, if he has to put his suit jacket on, or whatever in between, he's part of that full generation. So even generations themselves, within themselves, are not the same. You change yourself, right? So that, I think, should be expected. But I think at the same time, I think there are some real huge factors out there. I don't care what generation you're in. We have just seen 7 million people die over the last few years. Okay, that is a traumatic event and a tremendous event. Not that we weren't already sort of pushing toward remote working, but COVID and the pandemic and lockdown kind of accelerated a process that was already moving in that direction. We just probably moved there 10 or 15 years earlier, right? But then, look, you see all these people, die, and everyone has to think about, do I want to be doing this? Or do I want to be doing this the same way I always have been doing it? So, these things affect all of us, right? And so I think sometimes what I don't want to get into is this notion of, the millennial versus, the baby boomers and all that kind of, because I don't think that's really necessarily helpful, because, I have some millennial children who are extremely anal, right? And I have some, older brothers who are baby boomers who are as laid back as can be. So, and in terms of how they approach things, so I don't want to, and then, how do you, it's, those things are maybe good for marketing at times, but it's hard for me to sort of figure that out from the workforce. My favorite quote, and I think I shared it with Val earlier this week, the FDIC vice chairman was talking about, bank failures and how rapidly banks have failed compared to what's happened in the future, because you don't have to line up to take your money out of the bank. You can do that, over the internet. And all of a sudden the bank is losing its money. And so his quote, he actually quoted The Wire. He said, the game's the same. It's just gotten more fierce. And I love that quote, because to me, this really describes what's going on. For attorneys at law firms, they have to, if you want to advance, you need to figure out a way to get mentored, to get trained, to go through all those processes. As employers, you got to make sure people get trained. You have a workforce that unplugs their computer and leaves. People used to say your workforce, your human capital gets in the elevator every night. And they don't get in the elevator every night. They unplug their computer and they get a new laptop and they're somewhere else. So so that's an issue on both sides. And so that's why, I think we just need to be intentional, but also recognize the context that we're in and sort of try to grow from that standpoint.
Yeah, I think to answer your question about, yes, there are generational differences. Yes, there should be generational differences. And yes, there must be generational differences. That's, the crux of diversity. So you have if you look at the onset of the pandemic and us going to remote working, looking at it generationally, who was more adept at jumping right in there and, without skipping a beat? The younger generations of folks they already had their equipment set up. They're already, just well adept at working remotely. And I think some of the older generations who we tend to think that we're smarter, it took maybe a step or two for some of the older generations to get on board. And to be able to operate this way. But we want to have that type of diversity. One of the most important things that I find, and for my job is going that extra step to understand in depth my client's business, not just black letter law. You have this problem, the law says X, Y, Z, but what is your business? What is your industry? How do you operate? And I find out in certain types of businesses, younger generations are well immersed in that business and they bring that to the table. And that's what you want with diversity, not just diversity of not just ethnic diversity, but diversity of thought and diversity of knowledge. And I think having those generational differences is what helps us bring a better solution to our clients, because you have basically some of these younger generations are subject matter experts on particular clients and how they work in that industry. For example, I have an associate that I work with a lot. We work with a lot of clients in the retail industry. I don't know the retail industry as well as this associate does, but together we're doing an excellent job at making a client understand that together, as a team, we understand your business. It's not just the great legal work that we do for you, but when you have to make decisions, we take into account the fact that we know your business as well, and it makes for a better decision. That goes for ethnic diversity and other types of diversity as well, but also, and in particular, I think in these days where you have a lot of emerging companies, it also goes with generational diversity. So yes, we need it. We need more of it. We need to understand it. We need to stop, some of the older folks need to stop thinking that they know everything and make sure that they embrace the diversity in just every type of way into bringing the client a better solution.
Thanks, Dennis. So Ling Wang, When you're thinking about that intersection of diversity and kind of in a remote or hybrid setting, how does that inform your hiring?
I think that the remote work environment, as we said at the outset of this discussion, has made hiring an easy way, not an easy way, but an easier way to ensure we are prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we have more freedom geographically, to pull from in terms of talent. We talked about kind of the disadvantages sometimes of remote work. And, as an in-house attorney, when I think about hiring new folks, I do like to steal from law firms, and I've done that quite often in the past because of the benefit of the mentorship and the training that junior lawyers can receive at firms that in-house operations are generally not as set up to provide due to resource issues. And early on, as the pandemic kind of continued, and for an extended period of time, I did wonder about the quality of that mentorship and whether or not the remote environment was impacting that. And I talked to a lot of my friends who were law firm partners, and they said that there is an impact, that the sort of shadowing that happens organically in the office with a junior attorney, participating in meetings with senior attorneys, that wasn't happening as naturally or as frequently anymore. So it did leave a question in my mind about how much we can sort of expect in terms of the quality of mentorship and training when we look and evaluate junior attorneys at law firms for in-house roles. But I think all of the efforts we're talking about today is trying to make sure that any impact is mitigated as much as possible. We were talking about what are specific things organizations can do to help facilitate the efforts that both the senior and the junior attorneys are trying to make to bridge that gap. There were a lot of like interesting perks that I think companies were trying to offer to get people back into the office. Things like, you get as many donuts as you want, or you can sit in this massage chair. But ultimately, I think the data showed that those aren't the reasons why people come into an office. They come in for the connections with other people. And so I think one thing that can help employees who are grappling with different schedules and people working from home and those coming into the office is maybe the organization, if they have a policy about being in the office, maybe you move away from saying, come into the office 1 or 2 days a week. It doesn't matter what day, because maybe that's not helping the cause. And maybe you need to designate, if you want to designate people coming into the office, specific days where everybody needs to be there. Maybe it's 1 day a week, every Wednesday, everybody's in the office. Then you're actually helping managers and other employees. You're helping them achieve, their goal of wanting to schedule a meeting with someone in person. You're actually facilitating that and making it easier.
Right. And when you think about it in that context where you really do, when you're hiring more junior associates, you're looking for that someone who's already been somewhat mentored and who's received the appropriate training. Do you think that it makes sense for entities to start looking at doing more secondments to hire and retain younger, diverse talent as a way for them? You can test out. It's kind of a runway to test out and make sure that they have those requisite skills before committing. What are your thoughts on the use of? I've definitely seen an increased use of secondments, and even in a remote and hybrid setting. So, what are your thoughts on kind of novel things that entities can be doing to bridge that gap?
I think that's a wonderful idea. And I think it will add to the menu of options that, we can present to junior lawyers to help them get that mentorship. I mean, at the end of the day, when I evaluate outside counsel, I'm looking for outside counsel who can speak the language of our business partners and who can provide me advice that I don't then have to translate, spend hours translating, for the business to understand. So the value, I think, of doing secondments is that a junior attorney or any attorney who's being, placed at an in-house environment can really understand the challenges a lawyer who is in-house has. Because we're not, in my opinion, if you're an in-house lawyer and you're doing a good job, you're just a business person who has a law degree. You're very much part of the business. And so you have to be able to speak that language and not create a buffer by being so academic, and so legalese. So I think it's a great idea to add to sort of the tools that law firms can use to make sure their junior lawyers are getting that mentorship and can be successful in their role as a lawyer or elsewhere if that's where they end up going.
That's great. When you're thinking about environments that are hybrid, where you have people who are coming in and you have people who are primarily remote, or people who are coming in only once or twice a week, what are some of the things that you can do to more fully integrate those two kind of opposite ends of a spectrum and find a balance somewhere in the center to ensure connectivity and cohesiveness? I'll start with Richard.
Sure. I think there are a couple of things you can do. One is you can just all decide to come in on one particular day. Some companies are going to, and law firms are going to, this notion of anchor days as a means for people to get together and receive the training. Team days, which is interesting because this is more of a response to being remote that was not necessarily going on before the pandemic. Just want to make an additional point here about if your organization, inequality is structured. All right, it is not by accident why there is a lack of diversity, equity, inclusion in your organization. It's built like that. Right. And so the question is, you got to be truthful about it. It's not, well, I don't know, it kind of happened. Like, no, it's like the other inequality you see in society is structured. Now, obviously, there's individual agency and whatnot, and there's ways, for all of us on this screen, played the game, knows how to play, right? And we've been able to benefit, but doesn't mean that the game is fair, right? And so, but we've been able to do that. But it is structured. And so, without sort of recognizing your own faults and being truthful about who you are as an organization, right? You're going to have difficulty really making progress when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, that is to me a key point. And so when we are thinking about, retention, recruiting, all these things, we need to be intentional about it, but we also need to recognize, we do things that hurt it. And sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. And like one perfect example in terms of thinking about remote working, it's like, yeah, let me spend 2 hours every day in traffic, one way to work, and the other way going home. That's 4 hours out of your day that you're in traffic. All right. You're not able to do work. All right. And so we want people to do that 5 days a week or 6 days a week. That's 20 hours a day of unproductive time. All right. That doesn't make any sense. But it took a pandemic for us to figure out, oh, wow, yeah. Because sometimes we don't even understand how we're harming ourselves structurally, right? But I do think that has to be the point. So however you build up these systems between hybrid, remote, fully in the office, you got to look at that structure and really focus on whether or not you are set up to succeed in the area. And mostly we're not, because what we take as normal is structured inequality.
And I think there are two things that our company did that I think help I guess with integration of your work in remote work and remote workforce. One, our new employee orientation is in person. It happens once a month, and it's at our headquarters in Boston. And we will fly our new employees, even if they live elsewhere, to Boston for that new employee orientation. Two, our legal team, even though we are a remote legal team, we once a month will go to Boston for offsite, for an offsite experience. I say that because it's not actually 2-3 days full of meetings. It's some meetings, but it's mostly team building. We volunteer, we clean up the river, we do things together to help close the gap in that sort of loss of human interaction that we have from working remotely. Now, both of those activities require an investment by the company. You have to pay for travel, you got to pay for hotels. But for organizations that are saying that they support DE&I, they got to put their money where their mouth is. You got to spend the money to create these opportunities to ensure you can have a remote workforce. And since we know that women and those from diverse backgrounds generally, and there's data to support this, generally to prefer to work remotely, by facilitating a remote workforce, you're therefore, helping your DEI efforts in a very meaningful way, but you got to spend the money.
Those are great points, Ling Ling. So when you're thinking about what a successful DE&I strategic plan, for those who are thinking about putting together one or those who already have one, when you think about what a successful plan looks like, what does successful implementation look like? What are some of the like top 3 things that come to mind? Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, first of all, I'm going to call this one intentionality and being very specific tactically about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. All right, I'll just call that one. Second point I would say is continuing to assess and evaluate what you're doing. If it doesn't work, what works, what doesn't work, spin on a dime to do something else. The third thing is think about the economics. DEI is having a diverse organization. Studies show and makes your organization more profitable. Okay, yet we tend to speak about DEI in terms of it's the right thing to do. Now, I'm more concerned about people being effective than I am concerned about them being righteous. I don't need you to be righteous. I just need you, for this organization really to grow, we need to increase our profitability. If you're for-profit organizations, that's what you're doing. This is how we get there. And it's the right thing to do sometimes. That sort of mentality, it empowers those who have benefited from the current structure it's about helping them feel good about, stuff that should be actually help them feel wealthier. Okay. And it's a way of ignoring sometimes the insecurity that exists in these organizations because they're not focused on the organization getting bigger or the organization getting more profitable. They have this insecurity because they're perceiving some loss of power. What we see in our society generally, we see it in our organizations. All right. And so that again, let's be truthful about that. But if we base our DEI program around the profitability and economics, people may not be able to rally around, black or white or brown, but they can rally around green dollars. We're doing this. This makes the most sense for our organization to thrive. And I think that has to be the core of your DEI strategy.
Yeah, I absolutely agree about the economic component of your strategy, especially as it relates to whether or not you're going to maintain a remote workforce. And if so, to what extent will they be remote? Because what I see a lot of firms doing is announcing policies that you have to be back in the office this many times a week. And it's really driven by this perception that other law firms are doing it, so we have to do the same thing. And you see it with tech companies, financial services companies. And I think what gets lost there is that your employees are going to view that as an experiment because it wasn't based on any sort of data that's unique to that organization. One example is the Wall Street Journal has this daily podcast called Your Money Briefing. And last month they had a little segment on remote work and the importance of doing your homework. So you're actually solving problems that you have. And so they spotlighted an HR software company who had a remote workforce. I think they were allowed to come in. They were supposed to come in 2 or 3 days a week. And the owner did a deep dive and found that on the days that folks were working remotely, they saw 30% less subscribers on those days. And so because of those figures and because of that data, he wondered whether we need to go to 5 days a week, because it looks like on the days that people aren't in the office, there's a drop in subscription and therefore a drop, in the revenue they're trying to bring in. So that's a type of analysis you want to be doing to make sure whatever policy you come up with is actually solving the issues that exist from an economic standpoint, but also so that you can continue to prioritize remote work in a way that makes sense, not just for your workforce, but also for your business.
Yeah, and I think it's important, but it still is an ethical obligation, and that can't be dropped no matter what. You don't want to see a situation, and we've seen it before, where if a company then is not doing well, and they've made significant diversity efforts, then they start to have layoffs, where it's disproportionately impacts the diverse part of the workforce. So I think hand in hand with that is the fact that it is an ethical obligation. You couldn't count on both hands, both feet, the number of benefits to maintaining that up, and diversifying the workforce and allowing people who are talented to actually contribute in a way that benefits the company. But we want to make sure that we look at all of those different aspects of why diversity in a remote or non-remote environment is important.
That's great. Great points. What practices or policies have you seen that are?
Hey, Val,
yeah.
I'm actually have a hard stop. It's 10:30 Eastern. I actually have a hard stop here, folks. I really enjoyed participation in the panel, and you guys continue to have a great day.
All right. Thanks so much, Richard.
All right. See you.
Participation. Okay. So what practices or policies have you seen that are meant to ensure hybrid or remote workers aren't being treated differently in the context of communications, work assignments, performance reviews, and just general inclusivity?
I have seen some companies change sort of the framework through which they evaluate their employees. Rather than looking at hours logged or work hours, they're looking at really work outcome. That's an important consideration you can bring into the evaluation process to make sure there's less inequities from the remote workforce and the way you're evaluating your remote workforce versus those who are there.
Great. That sounds great. Dennis, anything that you'd like to share? Any thoughts that you have?
Well, I think we covered a lot. So I'm really just happy to be here and happy to hear the comments and thoughts that all the other panelists have had. And what I've seen in the chat as well. So I'm happy. I'm good.
Okay, perfect. One thing I would say is that where you're trying to bridge the gap between the people who may be working primarily remote and people who may be in the office on any given day, it's really about intentionality and being thoughtful, and it takes a plan. So for instance, I generally host an all office meeting twice a month. And I notice that the people who are in person feel far more engaged. They're far more likely to ask questions or to comment or to pressure test whatever the subject matter is in the meeting. Whereas people who are on the screen, oftentimes they want to chime in real time, but if you're not looking at the screen and seeing that someone has raised their hand or someone just tries to keep interjecting, it can make that really difficult. And so I think that, it requires, for me, I actually have someone who is watching the screen in the room who can wave their hand at me and say, hey, somebody has a comment. Hey, somebody wants to chime in, who is remote, but is is seeking to participate more meaningfully in the meeting. And so I think that when it comes to bridging that gap, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but I think it does require some planning and some thoughtfulness. At this point, I think we're pretty much coming up on the end of our session, so I'll turn it back over to Matt. But thank you all for taking the time to participate in this panel with us.
Great, thank you, Val. On behalf of the chapter, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our sponsor, Perkins Coie, and to our panelists, Val, Richard, Dennis, and Ling Ling. We will now be taking a break. However, if you have questions and you would like to speak to the panel directly, feel free to remain here, take yourself off mute, and to address the panelists. Thank you very much, and we'll meet back here in 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back from the break. My name is Mara Sen, Executive Global Compliance Lead at GE Healthcare. I'm also a member of the Programming Subcommittee of the ACC NCR DEI Committee. I will serve as the chapter's host for this session. We will now transition to our second session of the day. We are pleased to announce that our sponsor, Kilpatrick Townsend, will join us for a discussion on successfully partnering with outside counsel to implement diversity and inclusion initiatives. As a reminder, if you have a question during this session, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The panel will address your questions as time permits. Once again, all remarks made by today's panelists are their own opinions and do not constitute legal advice or necessarily reflect the viewpoints of their company or firm or of ACC NCR. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our panel for today's presentation. Yandalela Neely Holston is a partner and chief diversity and inclusion officer at Kilpatrick Townsend and Stockton. She focuses her practice on labor and employment law, advises her clients through all aspects of the employment relationship, including policy creation and implementation, resolution of difficult employment issues, and development of strategies to avoid employment disputes. She understands that a critical part of helping clients address employment issues is understanding the client's business structure, values, and aspirations. Importantly, for today's conversation, in her role as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Yandalela is responsible for overseeing, implementing, and providing strategic leadership related to Kilpatrick Townsend's diversity initiatives. This includes working with and advising the firm's clients on the same. Elizabeth Lester is Assistant General Counsel for Intellectual Property at Equifax. As the lone IP attorney at Equifax, she manages and implements Equifax's global IP strategy, which requires her to identify intellectual property and the best way to protect it and realize the most value from it. She is active in the IP community, currently serving as Vice Chair of the Georgia Intellectual Property Alliance IP Education and Awareness Initiatives, Vice President of the Association for Corporate Patent Counsel, and on the IPO Membership Committee, and previously served 2 different terms on the IPO Board of Directors as a regular corporate member. Elizabeth was shortlisted last year for Chamber's Diversity and Inclusion Awards, North America In-House Diversity and Inclusion Lawyer of the Year Award, and earned the Special Counsel Award in the 2017 Corporate Counsel Award sponsored by Atlanta Business Chronicle and the Association of Corporate Counsel Georgia Chapter. The award honors an outstanding corporate counsel who specializes in employment, tax, privacy, intellectual property, or real estate. With that, let's begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Mara. Can you see my screen? Is everyone seeing it? Perfect. So thank you again for the wonderful introduction and the disclaimer. I think when I speak, I usually need one of those. I really appreciate you doing that as well. So happy to be here to speak with everyone about successfully partnering the term was coined by Louis Griggs in the 1980s. So why are we still talking about it almost 40 years later? Well, women, people of color, and LGBTQA+ people are no longer expressly excluded from the practice of law. The vestiges and impacts of the systems that kept us out for so long are still alive and kicking. And unfortunately, they are present in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that makes identifying and combating them hard while they continue to have significant impact. And to illustrate that point, let's look at a few numbers. So I don't like economics. I didn't do well in that class at school, but I did manage to understand the concept of supply and demand. So when discussing diversity in the legal profession, most people start with the pipeline. And so we will start there as well. However, most of the pipeline discussions are based on the premise that there's no diversity in the pipeline. That is a false premise. For several years now, at least half of law school graduates have been women, and approximately 1/3 have been people of color. Indeed, according to the American Bar Association, of the 38,060 people entering law school for the first time in the fall of 2002, 21% were women of color, 35% were people of color, and 56% were women. So diverse people are going to law school. Many are also being hired as summer associates. In 2022, approximately 55% of all summer associates were women, according to the National Association of Law Placement 2022 report on diversity in U.S. law firms. And similarly, the percentage of summer associates of color increased by 1.7% in 2022. However, it seems that these people are getting lost in the associate ranks. Now, 2022 report on diversity in U.S. law firms, which was based on the data of about 99,000 lawyers at over 800 law firms, 825 law firms across the country, found that in 2022, 6% of law firm associates were LGBTQA+, 17% of law firm associates were women of color, 28% of law firm associates were people of color, and 49% of law firm associates were women. And so this representation continues to decrease as diverse attorneys progress through their careers. In the more than 25 years since NALP has been tracking this data, the gains for women and partners of color have been minimal at best. And in 2022, only 2% of law firm partners were LGBTQA+, 4% of law firm partners were women of color, 11% of law firm partners were people of color, and 27% of law firm partners were women. So there are multiple takeaways from these numbers, but the ones I want to flag here for us is that there's not a pipeline or a supply problem. Our law schools are diverse. Women are the majority of law school students, but are less than half of associates and only about a quarter of partners. And as you can see, this funnel effect is present and arguably even worse for women of color. And LGBTQ+ people and people of color are also not immune from the funnel effect. So the issue is not the pipeline, it's how we artificially narrow it. So we've established that we have supply, but the legal profession has a diversity and inclusion problem. Why? The raw numbers are there. Law schools are clearly producing women and people of color lawyers in somewhat large quantities. Yet law firms are still largely male, largely white, and largely heterosexual. Well, the issue isn't because people aren't noticing. There has been demand for some time. The world, particularly you, the buyers of law firm services, have noticed for a while that there were some challenges, if you will, with regard to law firm diversity. In 1988, Harry Pierce, the GC of General Motors, wrote a letter to the company's lawyers urging the firms to include, quote, minority lawyers at the requisite level of experience on all GM matters. Despite getting several other GCs to sign similar letters, the Pierce letter had little practical effect. Approximately 11 years later, Charles Morgan, the then GC of Bell South, wrote a new letter. This one was directed to other companies. And he urged them to, quote, use their purchasing power to pressure law firms to increase their internal diversity. More than 500 general counsel eventually signed on to Morgan's letter. Unfortunately, Morgan's letter, like Pierce's letter, had little effect beyond getting companies talking more about diversity. So then in 2004, we saw another letter. This time, Rick Palmore, then GC of Sarah Lee, issued a call to action, asking GCs to pledge they will make decisions regarding which law firms represent our companies based in significant part on the diversity performance of the firms. And then in 2020, as we were all trapped in our homes, watching the world as we know it seemingly unravel, many corporations and legal departments around a variety of industries committed to tackling social and racial injustice and to holding their legal partners accountable to doing the same. So we have, as we see, there's not a supply issue, and the buyers of legal services are demanding diversity. So we have demand, yet diversity still lacks. Despite the supply and demand, we continue to make incremental progress. According to a study done by Diversity Lab, it will be 2057 before at least half of law firm partners are women. That's 25 years from 2022, when women were 56% of law school enrollees. And we all know that making partner takes a long time, but 25 years is a bit of a stretch. And then if you look at people of color, who, as you may recall, were 35% of first-year law students, it will be 62 years, so more than half a century before representation creeps up to 33%. And this is what I call the diversity problem. So we've identified the diversity problems and ostensibly ruled out both supply and demand as contributors. So why then is there still a problem? We're gonna do a quick poll to see if we can figure it out. I ask each of you to participate in the poll, and you can do it in one of two ways. You can participate online or via text. If you're going to participate on your computer, go to poll, POLLEV.com, and enter the word KT Presents on the screen. If you want to use your phone, text KT Presents to the number 22333. Yes, 3. And then if you could give me a thumbs up in either your reactions or say something in the chat to let us know when you're all registered, we will proceed. Thank you. Justine Lewis, I see you're ready. You're quick with it. And I see there's some feedback. Has that changed or is it still there? All right, I've only seen one thumb up and one ready, two readies in the chat. If I can get a third ready, then we will proceed to the poll, either via reaction on your screen or in the chat. Perfect, we got a third. First question, what is the first thing you look for when hiring outside counsel? You can put in one word, you get one answer, so make it count, and just text it if you are on your phone, or if you are on the computer, just enter it in. And I see people are, you're figuring it out. So for those of you familiar with word clouds, a word gets bigger the more people who say it. So expertise seems to be the prevailing response. And as you can see, we have competence and experience, practical knowledge, experience, subject matter knowledge. Those are all very much wrapped into expertise. We did have someone say demographics, which I believe goes to diversity and inclusion as well as values. OC, so I'm not sure what that means, but we'll go there, and then we have competence and experience. Awesome. Okay, so we will proceed because it looks like basically expertise, experience is prevailing. So most people on this call, and it's consistent with most people in the industry, say that experience and expertise is the first thing they look for when hiring outside counsel. So our next question, where people have already jumped ahead, how important is diversity in your ultimate selection of outside counsel? So if you could go ahead and put in either A, B, C, D, or E as it relates to the number of importance. Neck and neck. Seems as if everything, nope, I thought it was about to even out and slow down, but people are still entering. Give you a few more seconds. So it appears that for most of our audience, diversity is between being very important and somewhat important. So it does have a level of importance in your decision making, but it is not always the top thing you consider, but it is also not among the bottom. That's it for the polls, the interactive portion of it. But as you can see from both the focus on experience and the importance of diversity, there's a disconnect from what we look for in outside counsel and what we say is important what we say is important to us. And this disconnect, along with other things, have led to a continuance of the diversity problem. So regardless of what people say, relationships are often the biggest factor in outside counsel selection. You're more apt to go to the firms you know and the attorneys you know in the firms. Not only is this easiest and doesn't require research or investigation into capabilities, it also provides some level of comfort. And you know these attorneys and their work, and they have successfully represented you in the past, which makes you believe they will successfully represent you in the future. Changing counsel poses risk. It's not that diverse attorneys are less capable or unlikely to give you good results. You just don't know because you haven't worked with them. And so nobody wants to take the chance to find out. There's a fear that if you take a chance, you could be wrong. So while your trusted firm could screw things up, that doesn't feel as risky to you because you know that they could also do it right. New firms, new counsel don't get that same benefit. And as lawyers, we are risk averse, at least most of us are. So you want to go with the sure thing and avoid anything that seems like taking a chance. So let's say you're in a legal department of a widget company. Everybody's here been to law school, and we know how important widgets are to the legal industry. So your legal department works to keep widgets as a mainstay of the legal profession. And you have been successful at that because of the 1934 antitrust case in which your widget company defeated the government, which was backed by the gadget industry. Given the demographics of the legal profession in 1934, the attorney who handled that case was a heterosexual white male. In addition, because of the magnitude of the success, his firm became your go-to legal counsel. So the architect behind this 1934 widget decision is no longer practicing. But he had a protege, and he picked a protege who looked like him, which is what we call association bias, to continue on the legacy, right? And his protege also used a little association bias and picked the mini-me to continue on to work after him. So even though neither the protege nor the mini-me ever battled the widget company, when the DOJ comes knocking 90 years later, you tap their company, their firm to do the work because they had theoretically done it before, having worked under the 1934 architect, although not having done the case themselves. So all this shows us that given the historical demographics of attorneys and association bias, experience often becomes a proxy for a heterosexual white male attorney. It's not an intentional line, but they often have a draw. And so when we say we're looking for experience, looking for that type of work, that's kind of what it ends up translating into. Further, historically, in-house legal departments who expressly use diversity and inclusion when selecting outside counsel rarely reward, or at least who say they're using it, rarely reward their attorneys for selecting diverse counsel or reprimand them for failing to do so. Similarly, they don't often bestow additional work on those firms who succeed in their diversity efforts. Thus, the commitments are seen as hollow by both the internal attorneys and the outside attorneys. In addition, many in-house attorneys are reluctant to get involved in how law firms work. That means you're not going to investigate behind the numbers. Historically, unwilling to ask questions about why a person was not staffed on the case, who's getting credit for their work they send in, how many hours spent on their matters are distributed amongst people of different demographics. And so all of these seemingly benign and innocuous things are why we still have a diversity problem, despite what has been a stated commitment to it and a focus in the industry for several decades. And so today's discussion is kind of, so what do we do, right? Well, not the same thing. Doing the same thing, i.e. issuing hollow diversity statements, relying on attorneys who've always done it, and not digging behind the numbers with your outside counsel is going to get you the same results. Here you see the definition of insanity, which is often attributed to Albert Einstein. Don't know Einstein, so I'm going to go with it, but not sure. But anyway, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So let's do something different. And Elizabeth is going to talk to us about some things she's doing different in an effort to get different results.
Thanks so much, Yandalela. I had the pleasure of meeting Yandalela a couple of years ago, at the beginning of COVID, when I was organizing a panel for the Association of Corporate Patent Counsel. And it was so much fun talking with her, and also Facebook. I guess at the time it was still Facebook, but now Meta, right? And about what they had done and how that worked for them. And it's interesting because there clearly can be challenges depending on your influence in your internal department as to getting things done. As they mentioned during my introduction, I'm the only IP attorney at Equifax. That's good and it's bad. Bad for resource needs, good in that I have a lot of autonomy and get to make a lot of decisions about how I manage the practice. So there's a lot I can do individually, and that's what I focused on so far, because it takes a little bit extra oomph to try to get stuff done on a more institutional level. So something that's important to me, coming up, I'm a chemical engineer by background, so I've come up through the ranks as being one of the only women at the table. And same when you're in an IP practice group at a law firm. And it's interesting because in-house, our department, our legal department is predominantly women. So it's a totally different dynamic. It's a lot of fun. But at IP meetings, I'm still, women are still in the minority. And other underrepresented groups, you know, the numbers are just worse, right? And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to sort of take an individual position to try to do something. And so some of the things I've tried is putting into practice and making it known to my outside counsel that diversity of the attorney staffed on my matters is really important to me. And so I really don't want it to be, you know, a heterogeneous type of group of people. It needs to reflect my inventors, which are all color, shapes, you know, genders, and it needs to reflect different types of backgrounds and experiences, because the reality is diversity is good for the bottom line, and it helps my inventors feel more comfortable if they have people they feel like they can relate to and understand. And it also makes them more comfortable reaching out to outside counsel to ask questions if they feel like they have a connection in some way with the outside counsel. So that was the first thing I did, and that's an easy lift, right? That's sort of setting expectations with the people that are staffed on your teams and making it very clear that it needs to be a diverse team. Now, I'm still working on actually metrics and measuring and how that's going to fall through, right? And I'd like to set goals. Something else that you can do, though, is when you're hiring outside counsel, you know, for different matters, and when I'm not using my normal team, if I have a different type of matter, and reaching out to the diverse attorneys at the firm right? And going out and being like, okay, I'm going to go ask this person. And then when you're talking to them and you're engaging them, asking them questions, right? I think it's important that we advocate for them within their own firms and we understand how they're being compensated and how the work is being credited amongst the different attorneys in the firm. I have a long-standing relationship with Kilpatrick, and Equifax goes even further back. Our prior GC had been a partner there. So, we're kind of a legacy client, and I'm sure that different people in the firm have relationships and probably get some credit, and I don't even know who they are, right? And I think that that's an issue, right? Because I don't maintain my work with them because of those legacy relationships and those relationship partners. It needs to be looked at, and you need to advocate for the people who are actually doing your work to get the credit that they deserve. And sometimes that can be a little uncomfortable. When I first went in-house, my manager actually advised me against asking those questions. He said, how the firm staffs their matters is up to them. And I said, no, it's not. It's up to me, right? And how they compensate them influences my decision on what to send to them. And so it can be a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you weren't in a firm for long, or if you don't have familiarity with how they do their credits for billing or supervising or working or whatever like that. But at the same time, I think we have to understand that in order to be able to advocate for the teams that are doing our work and in order to move the needle. Something else you can do, and that I've done, is trying to mentor the diverse attorneys that are doing your work, making sure that you're taking the time to talk with them about their experience and their practice. What's good, what's not so good? Is there anything that you can do to help advocate for them? And also making sure that the partners know that they're working with, or that others in the firm know that you're happy with them, right? Like it's important to make sure you say, hey, we love this person. Like my inventors love this one particular patent attorney at Kilpatrick. And I try to go out of my way every single time to make sure that they know that they love her and that they specifically request her for their matters. They don't want to work with anybody else. So it's pretty cool. Oh, sorry. Can you see a squirrel? So I think it's important, though, that we consider these things. I see a question about, is this another way to think about supplier diversity? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I understand it a bit, and we're going to the supply diversity is one of our tips later on. But bringing the legal department into supply diversity programs is a way to think of it. I don't know if what Elizabeth was talking about would be considered part of a formal supplier diversity program, but yes, it does go to that concept, which is considering the diversity of the vendors, i.e. Service providers such as legal, that are helping your company or helping you.
Great. And in that time, my dog stopped barking. Knock on wood. Robert, I think that's a great point in asking when the associate's annual review is and making sure that you have a statement included. Anything that you can do to help advocate for them and get them that experience and exposure, I think is really important for their careers. Something to do in hoping that I can make change more holistically within Equifax is I have been working on revising our outside counsel legal guidelines to include an actual, we already say we consider diversity and inclusion within who we're hiring for outside counsel, but I'm trying to introduce and actually model it a little bit more off of what companies like Meta and others are doing. It's a little bit harder because obviously that's affects a lot of other attorneys and how they staff their teams. It also requires that we have the resources in place to measure, right? And so trying to figure out, how do you collect the data? What does that look like? There's privacy issues, and I think we're all concerned about that. So just trying to figure out the right way to do it. So I have a proposal in place. I'm working on advocating with my general counsel to put it in place, but competing priorities and getting attention can be a challenge when you're not the GC or one of his direct reports. So That's just something I keep working on, and I'm hoping I'll make progress. You can also encourage, and if you have the authority, look at signing on to ABA Resolution 113. And in that, it requires you to require outside counsel to complete the survey every year for that. And so it just provides more data, and then it will provide you with data then that you can help you figure out your decisions. And then there's actually a supplement on top of that that gives you information about how your matters are being staffed as far as the diversity of the attorneys who are actually billing for your work. And I think it's important that when we're looking at putting these practices, I realize I'm drifting, we realize that we're putting these practices in place, that we do it in a way that isn't too onerous on the law firm. And that was something I asked Jan Delela about, and I think that Meta has worked with them on as well. Using standards surveys that they're already completing, and then if you're asking for supplemental information, using a consistent form or making it in a way that it's not going to be a challenge for them to complete it, right? Because we don't want to overburden them when you're just one of many clients that are asking for the same type of information. There are some technical solutions. Different e-billing systems do allow for collection of demographic information on the people who are staffed to your work. I haven't put that in place personally at Equifax just because I don't want to see that information for privacy purposes, and I'm not sure that it can be done in a way yet where it would be sufficiently behind the scenes that I wouldn't see it, where everybody would feel comfortable and willing to share it. So I think that is something that's really important for us to think about how to collect the information, especially for information that's not readily apparent, right? So if somebody's sexual identity or orientation is not otherwise apparent, if they're not out, you don't want to out them unnecessarily. So there's just a lot you can do. Some other things that I've done just as an individual, at Equifax, we have a relationship with the Georgia State College of Law, which is where I went. So that's why I went with them. And most law schools have externship programs for their law students. And most of them have opened it up to corporations. Some corporations will pay, some don't. I don't have budget, but they do get class credit, and they get a great opportunity working with me and my eternal thanks. So I have interns every semester, and I do have a tendency to, and honestly, most of my applicants tend to be diverse candidates, which I kind of find interesting, but it's great. I love it. And so I have 1 to 2 interns a semester, and I'm able to provide them with exposure to what it's like working in a corporate law department, what it's like to manage outside counsel, the questions that I ask them, what it's like to work with my clients internally. And then they actually do work that's helpful for me. So I think there's a lot you can do as an individual, even if you don't have authority to change policies in your department on a bigger scale. So.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Those were great tips. We have a few others. So Elizabeth provided a lot of great ideas. And here's what some other companies are doing to break the cycle of insanity. So in June 2005, Walmart wrote each of its top 100 law firms as determined by invoices for legal services, informing them that Walmart would end or limit its relationship if they failed to demonstrate a meaningful interest in the importance of diversity. Walmart also made each firm submit a slate of candidates with at least 1 woman and 1 attorney of color to be considered for appointment as the new relationship attorney at the firm. And according to Walmart, within 4 months, the initiative had resulted in, quote, the changing of 40 relationship attorneys, representing a shift of $60 million worth of legal work to be managed by women or minority attorneys, end quote. So that's what they reported to be the results of their efforts. Noting that the quote business imperative for diversity is incontrovertible, end quote, PepsiCo procures external legal services. When it does so, it seeks people who share our values and believe as we do that diversity is integral to retaining legal representation as the highest quality available anywhere in the world, end quote. PepsiCo sees the role that it has as a major consumer of legal services and the impact that can have on the diversity of the profession. All firms doing work for PepsiCo are required to complete a diversity survey, the results of which the company uses to assign a diversity index score, so a DIS. An in-house counsel there may use their discretion in selecting counsel with a DIS at the median range or higher. However, according to their external documentation, PepsiCo requires in-house counsel to get approval from the GC or Director of Business Operations if somebody wants to hire a firm with a lower than median DIS. And they also have to explain why a firm at the median could not have done the work. So that kind of puts an extra, burdens and hurdles in place and stops you from just relying on the same old people to the extent they are not progressing. In addition, the annual performance reviews for their SVPs in the legal department include an evaluation of their team's adherence to these guidelines about diversity and outside counsel. In early 2020, Google launched a new diversity accelerator program for its key US-based law firm partners. The accelerator program defines diverse staffing targets and incorporates a set of best practice diversity pipeline initiatives designed to creatively address challenges with recruiting, development, and retention of diverse attorneys. Among other things, firms must report data on their demographics and the demographics of the Google teams quarterly. In addition, they must annually confirm that quote, at least 30% of the partner spend was attributed to underrepresented attorneys, and at least 50% of non-partner spend was billed by underrepresented attorneys. Or they have to show a material year-over-year increase in partner and non-partner spend billed by underrepresented attorneys. Firms who do not meet these goals, according to Google's external docs, are required to answer to the company's chief legal officer, general counsel, or legal operations director. And then another example is that after collecting data on its legal partners' diversity for years, Amazon launched a financial incentivization program for increasing outside counsel diversity, and they did that in 2021. And as part of that initiative, they set targets for their U.S. firms based on the data they had collected over the years. Firms that do not meet or make progress toward one or more of their targets on an annual basis receive a reduction in their next retainer amount. Additionally, their most diverse firms are firms making the greatest improvements are eligible for non-monetary benefits from the company. So these are three very different but also intentionally targeted approaches to increasing diversity in law firms. What all these companies have in common is that they went beyond just words and just a quote stated commitment. They tied outside counsel money to demonstrating results, and they were not afraid to go beyond what has typically been believed to be the purview of in-house counsel. Hold on, see, we have some chat messages. So then, here. Unfortunately, history has taught us that law firms need a bit of a boost to do the right thing. That boost often comes from our clients, but more than merely a stated commitment to diversity is needed. If you want your outside counsel to take diversity seriously enough to act, you need to make it expressly clear. So you're gonna have to set targets and goals for them to hit, and you're gonna have to demand they meet it if they want to keep working with you. You can't just say that you need to be prepared to act on it and that will break a long-standing relationship, especially when you have firms that continually underperform and don't suffer any consequences. As Elizabeth mentioned, there's a couple places to start. One could be the ABA. As she mentioned, they created the Model Diversity Survey. I believe, as she noted, the only requirement for participating is that you acknowledge it and that you say that you will request that your outside counsel complete it. Most of your outside counsel are probably already completing it because of other clients. And so we do it at the beginning of each year. You can access the data. There is, to Elizabeth's point, an addendum to that survey that you can add and get specific information about the spend and the demographics of people working on your matter. So, because the survey seeks information regarding firm-wide demographics, and then you can also, then it can give you on your matter. It's not going to give you, give you your client as an aggregate. So it won't tell you an individual matter for a particular aspect. So when Elizabeth gets it for Equifax, it will be the entire company, not just the IP portfolio, but it's a starting point. And they ask about the demographics of relationship partners and trial attorneys and attorneys managing the matters. And they ask about the diversity and inclusion initiatives that are taking place within the firm. So they ask all those great questions, but you don't have the information unless you sign up for the ABA Model Diversity Survey. In addition, having the information is just one thing. If you can ask for all the information, and I definitely appreciate Elizabeth being very cognizant of not adding to the burden, and I see Justine co-sign on my appreciation to that. But I would complete more surveys for people if I knew it was going to have an impact, and that we weren't just collecting data. I think we're doing like analysis paralysis and collecting data on top of data on top of data, but then you get it and you're overwhelmed. You're not sure what to do with it, and it sits. And so professionals like myself see that we're pulling it, spending a lot of time doing it, and then we continue to see the profession stagnate.
Yeah.
So the ABA, go ahead, Elizabeth, what were you going to say?
Quick note on that, because it's interesting, because my initial stab at trying to get an enterprise policy in place, I had like goals, right? Like percentages. And the feedback that came back was get rid of the percentages and we can look at it again. And I'm like, but we have to have a goal to meet. So what my next proposal, just as a counter baby step sometimes, is we're going to establish a baseline and then we'll establish goals with each firm for the following year is sort of my approach. So, it'll be something. It's not as aggressive as I'd like to be. I think it depends on your firm or on your company and your GC as to what you're going to get through, but get creative.
Thank you. And then once you get the numbers, do something with them, right? Review them, analyze them, act on them, and look behind the numbers, right? So just having these numbers isn't enough. You need to look behind. You have to look behind what those numbers say. So if you are seeing certain billables, so you're looking at your total and saying, okay, yes, we have a large representation, but it seems like only one person or one demographic is getting the percentage of the credit, because you can ask those types of questions. Those are the ways you dig behind. Insist that a diverse partner, insisting that a diverse partner be in your team or handle a matter doesn't benefit that partner if they don't get any credit for the work, right? So you can take the Walmart approach and actively engage in determining who the relationship attorney is and how they benefit from your spend. That's a more, I wouldn't say extreme, but that's a more aggressive approach. But you could also just start asking questions and do some digging. You don't have to be afraid to do that. You are the client, so your questions will never be disregarded. Demand change if the answers that you receive, to Elizabeth's earlier point, are not what you expected or what you want. And even if your legal department as a whole is not willing to make a wholesale change, each of you has your own sphere of influence. When I was in-house, I would actively research a firm's capability to staff my matters with diverse attorneys before including them in an RFP. So I'm not even going to go out there if you can't do something. In addition, if the proposed team didn't include the diversity that I knew they were capable of providing, I would ask why not and request that the person or people I had identified through my own research be part of the proposal. In addition, I would note the lack of diversity when evaluating the firm and the fact that I had to advocate for it myself, despite knowing that they were touting diversity of their team. And as the young people say, there are levels to this, right? So I've outlined some of the steps you can take at each level. So as an individual, like we said, inquire into how compensation and credit works within the firm. Insist that those actually performing the work get the benefit of your business. Consider the talent pool at your partner firms and make proactive requests. Simple Google search. Looking to see the subject matter and the people. Every firm has a list of all their attorneys. And it doesn't take long to run it to ground. Make your commitment to diversity and inclusion known, like Elizabeth said. She said the people she's working with, she's telling them all the time, this is something that's important to me and will influence how I continue to work with you. And urge your leadership to prioritize diversity and inclusion. Also, what she said she's doing in trying to revise the outside counsel guidelines and bringing the department together around it. So that's what you can do at the individual level. At the legal department level, the legal department can state clear expectations for their law firms regarding diversity and inclusion. Condition the firm's continued work on meeting these diversity and inclusion requirements. Require regular reporting of diversity and inclusion data. Expand partner firms to include minority and women-owned firms, and include diversity of outside counsel and individual performance feedback ratings. So we talked about how at the SVP level in PepsiCo, their bonuses and their performance are tied to how well the people reporting up to them are in using diverse attorneys on their legal matters. So these are all things that a legal department can do to advance the ball or move the ball. And then at the company level, create a culture of diversity and inclusion. So it starts from the top up. Incorporate the commitment as part of the company's brand. There are several companies that we think about as being more inclusive and more willing to act on this topic. You can also include the legal department in the supplier diversity program. So I know we received a question about that earlier. And in a lot of companies, the legal department is kind of that one procurer of vendors that doesn't have to answer to the supplier diversity people. I'm not quite sure how that has always worked, but we've managed to cut out a little niche. And so maybe if the company decides that we won't let the legal department cut out a niche and that they will be part of the company's overall supplier diversity initiative. And then also don't issue affirming statements without supportive action. So just saying we care about it and then allowing business as usual doesn't help the cause. It gives us diversity fatigue and it makes people realize that you don't really care. And so they don't have to actually do anything in response. See, I think we had a few questions. I want to make sure we got them. Okay, I think it's some great back and forth. Okay, so we've covered it and basically the gist, and we're wrapping up because we know we were running a little behind, and it's been a action-packed morning, and we want to give people a few extra minutes to breathe, right? But there's that proverb that says the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, right? And so these are steps that you can take at each level. And I encourage you each to take a step. You have the power to make change. We hope, so I'm going to speak on behalf of Elizabeth, that you will choose to use that power. I also hope that you understand that committing to and demanding diversity and inclusion, our diversity in your matters, isn't settling for less or lower quality talent. I am sure that every woman or person of color here can attest to that. We are capable and qualified and waiting for our term at bat. And we both, Elizabeth and I, thank you for your time and for listening to us today. We've been monitoring the chat, but we're happy to entertain any questions that anyone has if they would like us to answer them before we turn it back over to Mara.
Hi, I had a question about the Mansfield rule. Have you found that to be an effective tool to make change, or is it performative, or what? I'd like your perspective.
Oh, I would prefer not to answer. Let me think about how best to do so. I think a lot of entities, even mine, have adopted it. I think when you're thinking about performance, the Mansfield rule, people talk about it in terms of the certification versus the actual rule. If you're talking about the actual rule, I believe there are some opportunities for it to have impact. At the very least, it's requiring firm leadership to think about the group of people at issue before making promotion decisions or hiring decisions. So it's making you go beyond where you're normally grabbing talent and consider people. So if we consider that progress, which I do, then it is working and it is advancing. If you're asking, is this rule changing the demographic makeup of law firm partners? No. It's been very incremental increases. And so just the objective data shows that that's not making a change.
Is there a change that you would make to the rule that would result in better impact?
Again, so we got to distinguish between the rule and the certification. So there are two different things. The rule is anybody can say we've adopted the rule, and that we are going to consider at least 30% diverse slate of candidates for various positions. Or some people say we're going to make sure our leadership has certain representation. So there's a distinction between the certification and the rule. What I would say in all instances is that we have to be more intentional in our actions and more willing to put pressure on outside counsel. And so I think people have been saying we'll adopt it, make sure you have the certification. We're considering whether you do it, but nobody is holding you accountable. The fact that there's been a rule, there's been a certification for so long, and while there's progress, it's so small that it's almost imperceptible. That shouldn't be the case. And so there's some disconnect. And I would say that the purveyors of the legal services, i.e. in-house counsel, the disconnect is because we don't also see the pressure being put there to return results as well.
So some additional context here, I think that's with the Mansfield rule and Mansfield certification, they're not necessarily looking at retention, right? And maybe they are now, but at least initially they weren't. And I think that that's one challenge with a lot of the surveys. If it looks like the number of diverse associates or partners is staying at least level or increasing, it's hard to tell if they're just hiring, if they're churning through them, right? Or actually growing the associates and promoting them. And so we're not going to see the numbers improve until we start looking at the actual retention. Yandalela, have you seen a survey that actually looks at like whether it's a net gain or
No, and I've seen some surveys try. There is a very comprehensive survey out there. Now, I'm not going to say the name because I don't want everybody to rush and try to do it because it has some serious privacy concerns, but I see them trying to look behind the numbers. The problem is you're sending surveys to lawyers. What we do is figure out loopholes. And so a lot of these surveys are written in a way that there's always a loophole you can put yourself into, depending on how they define things. And there's no definition, especially if you're looking at the partner level, that applies to every law firm. And so you'll have a good number of firms that are going to figure out a way to have their numbers presented to you in a way that gives you what you're looking for and has you to stop asking the questions. And I don't have a solution to that. It takes more of these, as somebody in the chat mentioned, like these one-on-one discussions once this data is given. So I think it's Justine, getting your ABA results, getting your addenda and saying, okay, let's talk through this. Who is the person where this is mostly going? How does credit work in your firm? Okay, who are those people? And maybe if at your company, you create a relationship attorney for each of your outside partners or law firm partners so that it's not one person's responsibility. And that person interviews the firm about the numbers and digs deeper in them. But there's not a a survey, I think, out there, but people can put in the chat if they disagree. That's going to give you exactly what you want and see the progress that you want.
Yeah, because I think I hate to say it, it's easy for a firm to hire and replace, right? But what I see, especially since I am in an incredibly diverse legal department, the number of women is crazy. The number of Black and brown attorneys, both male and female, is also very high. And so it's great. I love it. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, it's because we all love big law, right? And so if we're not progressing in the firms by choice or otherwise, how do we help make sure that others do have that opportunity if they want it?
And one of the things is we're all looking at the same pool of talent. So we went back, and we can go back again to the supply funnel. We have a large number of law students. So that's over 38,000 people that entered law school. And the demographics of that group of people is pretty diverse, and it filters down at each level. And so some of the filtering went to in-house jobs, but a lot of that filtering happens because of the many biases that we see in practice. And so you have people just discounting the qualifications, maybe based on the school they went to, even though we know schools and grades are not necessarily your predictor of success. Or maybe you are more tolerant of the challenges or the shortcomings and work product of some people other than other people. I'm working with first years, and I know there's challenges across the board. And so you have to extend that level of grace to everyone, but that's not how it works. And so those are things that are making the funnel smaller. And then you get to a point in your practice where you have this small funnel, and some of the diverse people in that small funnel are going in-house. But there were ways to keep it a lot bigger earlier on that we're missing and not dealing with. And so to your ultimate point and the question that brought us here, the turnover allows you to continue to hide it. Or the turnover where you're replacing with similar demographics. So Mara, I think it's all yours. I will stop sharing. Thank you all for allowing us to spend some time with you.
Thanks, Yandalela. Thanks, Elizabeth. This was an awesome and such a practical session. So I really enjoyed it. I think a lot of people must have as well, based on the comments. So at this point, we must conclude the session. On behalf of our chapter, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our sponsor, Perkins Coie, and to our panelists, Yandalela and Elizabeth. Back to you, Tamika.
Thanks, Mara. Thank you very much. We've discussed many important concepts today. Shortly, we'll move you to some breakout rooms. But before you go, I'd like to just thank Michelle Shelton, our sponsors at Perkins Coie and Kilpatrick, and all of the panelists for the wonderful sessions today. I'd like to thank KJ Forrest for sharing about the ACC maturity assessment and encourage your companies to take that assessment. We've been very engaged in the chat, and we've learned so much and are grateful to have had dedicated sponsor members and speakers bringing us this important content. We've learned about ways to combat diversity fatigue, and including the 3 R's of engagement and what's needed for a momentum mindset. We've dialogued about the importance of connection in integrating diverse attorneys. And we've been reminded that diversity, or the lack thereof, is still a problem, but definitely got some tools, both from panelists and that we've been sharing in the chat, to help combat that. I also want to thank the staff at ACC, especially Kasha and Shannon, Jordan and Stephanie, for all the work in putting a program like this together, getting us to this day and getting us through this day. It has been something, but definitely want to shout out the staff there. And so before you move into your breakout rooms, let me share the agenda for that discussion. We'll have a DEI committee member in each room that'll facilitate the conversation. And a quick reminder to facilitators, please take notes and share those notes with Kasha after the conference so we can be sure to share the learning. I would suggest that as you go into your breakouts that you do introductions, and then please discuss the following question with your group. Are there any tools, techniques, processes that your organization is currently using that are seeking to address some of the DEI issues that we've discussed today? And there have been many. And kind of what's been the success of those? And if not successful, what steps can be taken to move that forward? Kasha has just dropped that question in the chat box as well. And so I thank you in advance to all the room facilitators. I'm also reminding that Michelle Shelton will be joining us in the breakout. She'll be bouncing in and out of rooms, taking time to answer any questions that you might have. She might not get to all the rooms, but we do hope that she gets to a number of them. And so thanks in advance again, Michelle, for joining us. Stephanie's going to open up the rooms in a moment. And one final note, just to let you know, as you finish your discussion in the breakout rooms, you will sign off from there. You'll consider that being adjourned. We won't return to this main room for any closing remarks. You just got them. So thank you so much for joining us for our 4th annual DEI conference. And we'll now move you to your breakout rooms.